Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity takes its shoes off at the door, science speaks softly, and the ground beneath us occasionally keeps a secret for thousands and thousands of years. Tonight, we are heading into the dry caves, old lake beds, desert shelters, and buried coastlines of North America, following a question that sounds simple at first, but becomes stranger the longer you sit with it. When did people first arrive here? Not in the modern sense, not with maps, borders, written names, or tidy museum labels, but in the older sense. A person walking across damp ground, a hand-shaping stone, a family pausing beside a fire, a child leaving a footprint in mud that no one would see again until the world had changed beyond recognition. For a long time, archaeology had a fairly neat answer. Humans arrived in North America near the end of the last ice age, around the time of the Clovis culture, spreading south after crossing from Siberia into Alaska over the exposed land of Beringia, and then moving through an opening between great walls of ice. It was a clean story, and science does enjoy a clean story when it can get one. They fit nicely into textbooks, museum displays, and the sort of classroom diagrams where arrows sweep confidently across continents as if ancient people travelled with the punctuality of a well-organised bus service. But the Earth is not always so polite. Sometimes it leaves something in a cave. Sometimes it preserves a trackway. Sometimes it lets a stone tool sit beneath volcanic ash, waiting quietly until someone notices that it is in the wrong place, or at least in the wrong place according to the old timeline. Before we go any further, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you somewhere near the Pacific coast, where the ocean has been rising and falling over human stories for millennia? Are you inland, perhaps far from any shoreline, where it is easy to forget that deserts were once wetter, lakes were once larger, and animals now vanished once left tracks in the mud? And if you happen to know, what is the oldest human trace ever found near where you live? Not necessarily a grand monument or a famous ruin, but any sign that someone was there before memory had a name, a tool, a path, a burial, a painted wall, a shell bead, a campfire stain. It is a humbling thought, really, that wherever we are, someone else may have stood there long before us, dealing with weather, hunger, children, sore feet, and probably the Ice Age version of forgetting where they put something important. Some human problems, I suspect, are older than civilization. And if this kind of slow journey through deep history helps you settle down, wonder a little, or simply let the day loosen its grip, I would be very grateful if you gave the video a like and subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of Earth science reach others who might enjoy a calm walk through old mysteries. No rush, of course. Archaeology has waited 20,000 years for some of its evidence to be noticed. It can probably wait a few more seconds for a like button. Now, settle in, let your thoughts slow down, and imagine the continent before highways, before towns, before fences, before the familiar map we carry in our minds. Imagine North America during the Ice Age. Much of the north is locked beneath enormous sheets of ice. Sea levels are lower because so much water is trapped in glaciers. The Pacific coastline lies farther west than it does today. Valleys, beaches, and camps that may once have existed are now under the sea. Animals move through cold grasslands and wetlands. Mammoths, camels, bison, horses, giant ground sloths, dire wolves. And somewhere in that changing landscape, people are moving too. Not as a single arrow on a map, perhaps, but as many small decisions, many routes, many generations, each one following food, coastlines, rivers, weather, memory, and possibility. The traditional Clovis-first idea took shape because Clovis artifacts were clear, widespread, and impressive. These beautifully made stone points, found across much of North America, appeared around 13,000 years ago. And for decades they seemed to mark the beginning of the human story on the continent. They were hard evidence, sharp, distinctive, datable, and confidently human. In archaeology, that matters. A stone point with a recognisable form is much easier to accept than a smudge in sediment, a broken bone, or a trace of ancient DNA that might have moved through the ground like an uninvited guest at a very dusty party. So Clovis became the anchor. The first Americans many believed were Clovis people, big game hunters who moved south after the ice sheets opened a pass. It was a satisfying explanation, and for a long time, many proposed older sites struggled to convince the wider scientific community. Some had uncertain dates. Some had messy excavation histories. Some had artifacts that might have been natural stones, or bones that might have broken without human help. Archaeology is a science of patience, but it is also a science of skepticism. It has to be. When a claim changes the human timeline, the evidence cannot merely whisper. It has to speak clearly enough that other researchers can hear it through all the dirt, doubt, and geological background noise. Yet over the last few decades, the old story has become harder to keep in its original shape. Not because one discovery knocked it down in a single dramatic moment, but because evidence began arriving from different places, in different forms, and with different levels of certainty. Oregon in particular has become one of the places where the timeline began to feel less tidy. At Paisley Caves, in the dry country of south-central Oregon, researchers studied ancient coprolites, which is the polite scientific word for fossilized feces, and perhaps one of the few archaeological terms that can make a room full of adults suddenly behave like schoolchildren. But inside those humble remains were serious clues. Studies of fecal lipids and other evidence have supported the presence of people at Paisley Caves as much as about 14,200 years ago, and researchers at the University of Oregon have described the Paisley coprolites as among the oldest directly dated human remains in the Western Hemisphere. That alone does not sound like much if you're used to thinking in dinosaur time, where 10,000 years is barely enough for the universe to clear its throat. But in the human peopling of the Americas, 1,000 years can be a locked door opening. A few thousand years can change the route, the culture, the climate, the possibilities, and the questions we are allowed to ask. Then there is Rimrock Draw rock shelter, also in Oregon, outside Riley, where archaeologists have reported evidence suggesting human occupation more than 18,000 years ago. The Bureau of Land Management and the University of Oregon described stone tools, extinct mammal tooth fragments, volcanic ash dated to more than 15,000 years ago, and tooth enamel dated to about 18,250 years before present, in association with stone tools. That is the sort of detail that makes archaeologists sit up a little straighter, though perhaps still very calmly, because no one wants to spill coffee on the field notes. A tool below an old ash layer is not just an object, it is a problem for the old timeline. It says, in effect, someone may have been here before the story says they should have been here. And when the ground says that, carefully, repeatedly, and in the company of dates and stratigraphy, the story has to make room. Farther south, in New Mexico, the White Sands footprints have made the challenge even more direct. These are not just stones that might or might not have been shaped, or bones that might or might not have been struck. They are human footprints, pressed into the ancient mud of what was once Lake Otero. The National Park Service describes White Sands as having the largest collection of fossilized human footprints, with research indicating people were present in the Tularosa Basin at least 23,000 years ago. The footprints occur in layers with ancient seeds that were radiocarbon dated, including calibrated ages around 22,860 and 21,130 years ago. Later research using independent dating approaches has strengthened the case that the footprints fall in roughly the same early range, between about 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. Footprints have a different emotional weight from artifacts. A stone point tells us someone made something. A footprint tells us someone passed by. It is not an idea of a person, or a culture, or a migration model. It is the shape of a foot in wet ground, a teenager, a child, an adult moving across a landscape where mammoths and giant sloths also walked. It is astonishingly ordinary, which is exactly why it feels so powerful. Someone had somewhere to go. And then, sitting at the far edge of the conversation like a guest who has arrived much too early for dinner, there is the Cerutti Mastodon site in Southern California. This one is far more controversial. The claim is not simply a little older than Clovis, or even several thousand years older. The Cerutti Mastodon site has been argued by its original researchers to show signs of human activity around 130,000 years ago, based on broken mastodon bones found with stones interpreted as hammers and anvils. The San Diego Natural History Museum describes the discovery as sharply broken mastodon, fossils found alongside large stones that appeared to have been used as hammers and anvils, while also noting that the claim was expected to receive intense skepticism and has been debated strongly. The original Nature paper described in situ hammerstones and stone anvils associated with mastodon remains, with spiral fractured bone and evidence of percussion, though critics have argued that geological or other non-human processes may better explain the evidence. This is the part of the story where science becomes less like a straight road and more like a committee meeting in hiking boots. There are claims, counterclaims, methods, doubts, replies, and the quiet but necessary reminder that extraordinary dates require extraordinary care. Cerutti may not become part of the accepted human timeline, or it may remain a strange, unresolved signal. But even its controversy reveals something important. The old certainty is loosened. Researchers are now asking questions that would once have been pushed aside almost immediately. What makes this broader puzzle so interesting is that the evidence does not all point to one simple replacement story. It is not merely that Clovis-first was wrong and another neat arrow should be drawn across the map. The emerging picture may be messier and more human than that. People could have arrived by different routes at different times. Some may have travelled through interior corridors when conditions allowed. Others may have moved along the Pacific coast, using boats, beaches, kelp forests, estuaries, and marine resources as part of what some researchers call the kelp highway. This idea matters because the coastal route could have been available before an inland ice-free corridor was fully open and ecologically useful. It also comes with a frustrating problem, which is that many of the ancient coastlines people may have used are now underwater because sea levels rose after the Ice Age. Imagine trying to solve a mystery where many of the most important pages of the book have been placed very carefully beneath the ocean, not destroyed necessarily. Just extremely inconvenient to read without a submarine, a research budget, and a tolerance for cold water. A coastal route also changes the way we imagine early migration. The older schoolroom picture often shows people walking across a land bridge and then down through the continent, as if the journey were mainly a long hike with mammoths occasionally interrupting the scenery. But humans have been coastal animals too. We gather shellfish, we fish, we follow seabirds and tides, we build boats and rafts. We learn shorelines the way others learn mountain paths. If people moved along the Pacific Rim, their journey may have been less like a march through an icy gate, and more like a slow, generational relationship with the edge of the sea. Families could have travelled from one familiar inlet to another, stopping where food was reliable, learning currents, seasons, storms, and safe landings. No one needed to look at a map and say, "Today we shall populate a hemisphere." Ancient people were not trying to become a migration model. They were living. They were finding food, avoiding danger, raising children, grieving losses, telling stories, and moving when moving made sense. Archaeology later comes along and tries to reconstruct all of that from stone flakes, footprints, bones, ash layers, and in one memorable Oregon case, ancient poop. There is a gentle humility in this. For a long time, modern people have liked to imagine the past as simple, because it is distant. The farther back we go, the more we compress lives into labels. Clovis, pre-Clovis, Paleo-Indian, migration wave, occupation layer. But every label covers real human moments. Someone at Paisley Caves may have sat near the mouth of a cave and watched a changing lake basin. Someone at Rimrock Draw may have used a tool on an animal whose species would one day vanish. Someone at White Sands walked across wet ground while children moved nearby and the mud held the shape. The human timeline is not just a sequence of dates, it is a record of presence, and presence can be fragile. Most of the time, people leave nothing that lasts. A song disappears as soon as it is sung. A basket decays. A wooden tool rots. A camp is washed away. A coastline drowns. The archaeological record is not a complete archive, it is a collection of accidents that survived. That is worth remembering whenever we say, the earliest evidence is. What we often mean is, the earliest evidence we've found, recognised, dated, debated, and not yet lost. So tonight's story begins not with certainty, but with a careful kind of unease. Oregon's caves and rock shelters do not merely add a few interesting details to an established tale. They help widen the frame. Paisley Caves tells us that people were present in the northern Great Basin before the old Clovis-first model comfortably allowed. Rimrock Draw raises the possibility of even earlier occupation in Oregon, perhaps more than 18,000 years ago. White Sands places human feet in New Mexico during the last glacial maximum, when traditional routes into the continent seemed difficult or impossible under older assumptions. Cerutti Mastodon, controversial as it is, reminds us that some claims sit so far beyond the expected timeline that they force archaeology to examine not only the evidence, but the standards by which evidence is accepted. Together, these places do not give us a single finished answer. They give us something more interesting, a changing question. And that question is not only, when did the first people arrive? It is also, how many arrivals were there? Which routes were possible? What evidence has the ocean hidden? How many early communities left no trace we can currently see? How often has the human story been simplified because the surviving evidence happened to favour one place, one tool type, or one moment in time? These are not small questions, and they should not be rushed. They are best approached the way archaeologists approach a careful excavation, layer by layer with patience and with the understanding that the first thing you see may not be the oldest thing there. For now, picture a dry Oregon cave in the evening light. The air is still. The rock holds its temperature. Outside, the basin stretches wide and quiet, not empty, but quiet in the way old places are quiet when they have already seen more than they intend to explain. Somewhere in the sediment are traces that do not care whether they fit our timelines. They simply are. A fibre, a tool, a stain, a date, a clue. Human beings may have been moving through these landscapes earlier than many once believed, and perhaps by routes that were not drawn through ice-free corridors alone, but along shores now drowned, through river valleys now changed, across deserts that were once wetter, and into a continent that was never waiting passively to be discovered, because it was already alive with animals, weather, plants, and deep ecological rhythms. The story begins with the old idea that Clovis came first, not because that idea was foolish, but because it was once the best supported explanation available. Science often begins with the best answer it has, and then the ground, very slowly, hands it a better problem. For much of the 20th century, the story of the first people in North America was told with a kind of tidy confidence. It began in a cold northern place, somewhere between Siberia and Alaska, when sea levels were lower and a broad landmass called Beringia connected Asia to North America. From there, so the story went, small groups of skilled hunters followed animals eastward and eventually southward. They waited, or perhaps their descendants waited, until the great ice sheets covering Canada opened a passage between them. Then they moved down through the continent, carrying a distinctive stone technology, hunting mammoths and other large animals, and spreading with remarkable speed. This was the old Clovis-first model. It was simple enough to sketch on a classroom map with one arrow, which is always tempting, because arrows are very persuasive little things. They make history look as though everyone involved knew exactly where they were going. The name Clovis comes from a place, not a person. Near Clovis, New Mexico, at the Blackwater Draw site, archaeologists in the 1930s uncovered finely made stone tools associated with the bones of Ice Age animals. These tools were not ordinary flakes or casual cutting edges, They were elegant, carefully shaped projectile points, often long, thin and fluted, meaning that a channel-like scar had been removed from the base on one or both faces. That flute helped attach the point to a spear shaft or foreshaft, and it became one of the signature features by which Clovis tools could be recognised across enormous distances. The Smithsonian describes Clovis tools as having been long believed to belong to the first inhabitants of the New World, discovered in New Mexico and named after the nearby town of Clovis, while also noting that they are now dated around 12,000 years ago and that people are known to have preceded Clovis in the Americas. In older archaeological thinking, though, that final part had not yet been accepted. Clovis was not merely an early culture. For many researchers, it was the beginning. There was a reason the idea became so powerful. Clovis evidence was clear, widespread, and human beyond any reasonable doubt. A fluted projectile point is not likely to be mistaken for a naturally broken rock if it is found in the right context and studied carefully. It has shape, intention, repeated design, and a technological personality, if stone tools can be allowed to have such a thing. And Clovis points did not appear in only one lonely corner of the continent. They turned up across much of North America and even farther south in related forms. Smithsonian Magazine has described more than 10,000 Clovis points from about 1,500 locations, with the oldest securely dated points tracing back around 13,500 years, and with the technology spreading across broad regions within only a few centuries. That kind of distribution made the Clovis culture feel like a major event. Not a scattered hint, not a doubtful trace, but a continent-wide archaeological signal. For a field that often has to work from fragments, stains, and half-burned bits of bone, this was almost luxurious. The Clovis points themselves are beautiful in a quiet, dangerous sort of way. If you have ever seen one in a museum case, it can be surprising how much presence a piece of stone can have. It is just a tool, yes, but it is also a record of skill. Someone chose the raw material. Someone understood how stone breaks. Someone struck it again and again with control, removing flakes from both sides, thinning the edges, preparing the base, and finally creating the flute. A risky move that could break the whole point after a great deal of work. There is patience in it, and experience. There is teaching in it too, because technologies like that do not survive unless people learn from one another. A Clovis point is not only evidence of hunting, it is evidence of memory passing through hands. The old Clovis-first story also made sense because it matched what scientists then understood about Ice Age geography. During glacial periods, so much water was locked in ice sheets that global sea levels dropped, exposing lands now submerged. Beringia was one of those places. It was not a narrow little bridge like something a troll might guard in a fairy tale. At times, it was a broad region connecting Northeast Asia and Northwest North America, with landscapes that supported plants, animals, and likely human movement. The National Park Service's Bering Land Bridge materials explain how scientists and theorists came to understand that a land connection had once linked Asia and North America, strengthening ideas about migration between the continents. In the Clovis-first model, that land connection was the doorway. The ice-free corridor through Western Canada was the hallway. Clovis was the arrival in the rooms beyond. There is something very appealing about that structure. Doorway, hallway, continent. It gives the whole story a pleasing architectural order. Humans in Asia, low sea level, low. Bering Land Bridge, ice corridor, mammoth hunters, Clovis points, America's populated. If ancient migration had been planned by a travel agency, this would have looked like a very respectable itinerary, apart from the cold, the predators, the giant animals, and the complete absence of hot chocolate. It also matched the image many early archaeologists had of Paleo-Indian life. Highly mobile hunters tracking big game across open landscapes. Clovis points were found with mammoth remains at some sites, and the association made a strong impression. Here were people, weapons, and extinct animals, all in the same deep time setting. It looked like the opening scene of the human presence in the Americas. The timing seemed to work too, at least for a while. The last ice age was ending. The great ice sheets were retreating. Environments were changing rapidly. Large animals were under pressure from climate shifts, habitat changes, and perhaps human hunting. A culture with advanced projectile point technology spread across the continent around the same broad window in which many megafauna disappeared. It was tempting to connect all these things into one dramatic narrative. Humans arrive, hunters expand, mammoths vanish, a new world begins. The problem, as always, is that real history usually refuses to behave like a neat documentary sentence. It comes with caveats, overlapping causes, local differences, incomplete evidence, and enough uncertainty to make even a very confident arrow on a map start looking a little nervous. Still, for decades, the Clovis-first model had real authority. It was not just a casual assumption. It shaped how evidence was interpreted. If an archaeological site appeared to be older than Clovis, researchers often approached it with great skepticism. Sometimes that skepticism was reasonable. Early archaeology was not always conducted with the careful methods expected today, and some supposed ancient sites had poor dating, disturbed layers, or objects that might have been natural rather than human-made. A cracked stone can look like a tool if you want it badly enough to be one. A broken bone can look butchered if the context is unclear. Soil can move. Water can shift material. Rodents, roots, freezing, thawing, and simple human enthusiasm can all make a mess. Archaeology is very good at teaching patience, mostly because the alternative is embarrassment. But Clovis-first became more than caution. At times, it became a gatekeeper. The National Endowment for the Humanities has described Clovis-first as having been the accepted explanation for initial human arrival and expansion through North and South America, with artifacts needing to date after Clovis to be taken seriously. That is a revealing phrase, taken seriously. It shows how a model can shape not only what scientists believe, but what kinds of questions feel respectable. Evidence older than Clovis did not simply have to be good. It had to be exceptionally good, because it was pushing against an established framework. In that sense, the Clovis-first story was both a scientific theory and a habit of thought. It is worth being fair to the archaeologists who defended it. They were not foolish people clinging to a myth because they like the look of fluted spear points. They were working from the strongest evidence available at the time. Clovis sites were numerous. Clovis tools were unmistakable. Many pre-Clovis claims were weak. Radiocarbon dating was still developing. Excavation standards varied, and the deeper you go into the past, the more difficult preservation becomes. It is easy from the future to say, they should have known better, but science does not get to use evidence before it exists. It has to build with what has been found, and for a long stretch of time, Clovis was the most solid foundation anyone had. If you're building a bridge over a river of uncertainty, you use the stones you can see. You do not usually begin by stepping confidently onto fog. The strength of Clovis evidence also created a kind of visual bias. A finely shaped projectile point is dramatic. It photographs well. It can sit in a display case under soft museum lighting and look important. Other kinds of evidence are less glamorous, a hearth stain, a fragment of plant fibre, a few flakes from tool making, ancient human feces, which, while scientifically valuable, rarely gets invited onto the cover of a coffee table book. Some early human groups may not have used Clovis-style tools at all. They may have relied more on perishable materials like wood, bone, antler, cordage, baskets, nets, and boats, all of which decay much more easily than stone. If the earliest coastal migrants used watercraft, fishing gear, and shoreline camps, much of their world may now lie beneath the sea. In other words, Clovis may have looked like the first culture partly because it left behind the kind of evidence archaeology was especially good at finding. This is one of the quiet lessons of the Clovis-first story. The archaeological record is not a full record of human life. It is a record of what survives, where people have looked, and what researchers know how to recognise. Stone survives, bone sometimes survives, charcoal can survive. Footprints survive only under very special conditions, and most footprints ever made by humans vanished almost immediately, as footprints generally do, being rather humble and unambitious things. Wood rots, hide decays, fibres break down, shorelines drown, caves collapse, rivers cut through old deposits, later people disturb earlier layers. The past is not sitting underground like a complete library with the books in order. It is more like a library after a flood, an earthquake, and several thousand years of mice, with some pages preserved beautifully and others missing altogether. The old model also carried certain assumptions about what early people were capable of. In its most basic classroom version, the first Americans were imagined mainly as inland big game hunters, walking behind herds through open terrain. That image is not entirely wrong for Clovis people, but it may be incomplete if applied to all early people in the Americas. Humans by the late Pleistocene were already highly adaptable. They lived in cold places, warm places, coasts, forests, grasslands, deserts and mountains. They made tools from stone, bone, wood, and plant fibres. They understood animal behaviour, seasonal movement, and local materials. Many human communities around the world have been skillful with water, shorelines, and boats for a very long time. So the idea that people could have moved along the Pacific coast is not especially far-fetched. It only became difficult to prove because the coast they may have used is largely not the coast we see today. This matters because the Clovis-first model was tied closely to the ice-free corridor. The Cordilleran ice sheet to the west and the Laurentide ice sheet to the east covered huge regions of what is now Canada. If those ice sheets blocked passage, then a land-based migration into the lower parts of North America would have required a viable corridor between them. But a corridor is not useful merely because it is ice-free on a map. It has to support life. People need food, water, plants, animals, fuel and roots that are not simply exposed gravel and misery. A passage may open physically before it becomes ecologically welcoming. Anyone who has ever walked through a newly cleared muddy construction site will understand that technically passable and good idea are not the same thing. As evidence accumulated, researchers began to realise that Clovis could no longer be the very beginning. The Smithsonian now states plainly that people preceded Clovis into the Americas and that some people arrived nearly 15,000 years ago, probably by both land and sea. That is a major shift from the older certainty. It does not mean Clovis is unimportant. Quite the opposite. Clovis remains one of the most remarkable early archaeological cultures in North America. It represents a widespread and sophisticated technology, a visible human presence across huge distances, and a major chapter in the story. But it is no longer the first page. It is more like a bright, well-preserved page that survived in the middle of a book, whose opening leaves are torn, water-stained, and still being recovered from unexpected places. The discovery history itself is a useful reminder of how science changes. First, there is a strong pattern. Then a model forms around it. Then the model becomes the expected answer. Then awkward evidence appears at the edges. At first, the awkward evidence is dismissed, sometimes correctly. Then more appears. Some of it improves. Methods sharpen. Dating becomes better. Excavations become more careful. Old sites are reanalyzed. New sites are found. The model bends. Sometimes it breaks. Sometimes it survives in a revised form. Science is not a straight march from ignorance to truth, although textbooks often make it look that way because textbooks have limited page counts and do not want to describe 40 years of academic disagreement over sediment layers. In reality, science is more like a long conversation in which the ground occasionally interrupts. Clovis-first had another kind of power too. It offered a single origin moment. People like origin moments. We like to know when something began. The first step, the first tool, the first campfire, the first crossing. But human movement rarely works that way. Migration is not usually a single event. It is a process. It can include pauses, returns, failures, expansions, extinctions, blending populations and routes that open and close with climate. A group might move into a region and disappear. Another might arrive later. Some people might travel along a coast, others inland. Some technologies spread without people moving very far, pass through contact and exchange. A tool style can travel differently from a family line. A genetic lineage can survive where a technology changes. A language can vanish while descendants remain. The past is not obligated to keep its categories tidy for our convenience. The Clovis people themselves were not symbols walking around inside a theory. They were real communities living in a difficult, changing world. The late Pleistocene was not simply a backdrop with mammoths placed decoratively in the distance. It was an unstable period of warming, cooling, shifting vegetation, melting ice, rising seas, and changing animal populations. Clovis groups had to know the land intimately. They had to find stone sources, track animals, plan movement, maintain social ties, care for children and elders, and survive weather that did not care whether future archaeologists would find their tools impressive. Their technology suggests mobility and skill. The wide distribution of Clovis artifacts suggests either rapid movement, broad networks, shared knowledge, or some combination of all three. To say Clovis was not first is not to diminish them. It is simply to place them in a longer human story. One of the reasons the old story lasted so long is that it answered several questions at once. Where did the first Americans come from? Northeast Asia? How did they get here across Beringia? When did they spread? Near the end of the Ice Age, around Clovis times, how did they move south? Through the ice-free corridor. What did they do? Hunt large animals with fluted points. Each answer supported the next. It was like a table with 4 legs. But when one leg wobbled, the others began to look less stable too. If humans were south of the ice sheets before the corridor was open and livable, then maybe they used a coastal route. If people were in Oregon before Clovis, then Clovis was not the first human presence there. If footprints in New Mexico are more than 20,000 years old, then the entire entry timeline must move back. And if some controversial sites claim even earlier dates, then even if those claims fail, they show how much more carefully the field must define what counts as evidence. The phrase Clovis-first can make the old theory sound like a stubborn belief system, and sometimes it did function that way. But at its heart, it came from evidence that is important. That is. The old model was not invented from nothing. It was a reasonable interpretation built around the best-known archaeological pattern of its time. Its failure, or rather its revision, is not a failure of science. It is science doing what it is supposed to do, though perhaps more slowly than anyone impatient would prefer. New evidence arrives. Old explanations are tested. Some parts are kept. Others are discarded. The story becomes less simple and more accurate, which is a very common trade. Accuracy often arrives carrying extra baggage. By the time Oregon's older sites entered the conversation, the Clovis-first model had already begun to loosen, but Oregon added its own kind of pressure. The Great Basin, with its dry caves and rock shelters, has preservation conditions that can protect unusual materials. In places like Paisley Caves, evidence does not always come in the dramatic shape of a fluted point. It may come through organic remains, DNA, coprolites, fibres, and other traces that require careful laboratory work as much as field excavation. That kind of evidence asks archaeologists to think beyond the old visual language of Clovis. A person does not have to leave behind a beautiful spear point to have been present. Sometimes the body leaves a trace. Sometimes a plant fibre survives. Sometimes a fire leaves chemistry in the ground. Sometimes the proof is not glamorous, but it is still proof. This shift from a tool-centered story to a broader evidence story is one of the most important changes in the peopling of the Americas. Clovis points are visible, but visibility is not the same as priority. The earliest people in a landscape might leave very little behind, especially if they were few in number, highly mobile, or using materials that decayed. Later groups with distinctive stone technology might appear suddenly and widely, not because they were the first humans, but because their tools preserve well and are easy to recognise. It is a little like assuming the first person at a picnic was the one who left the largest cooler. Maybe they were. Or maybe someone else came earlier, ate quietly, cleaned up properly, and left only a crumb that the ants have been discussing ever since. So the old story of Clovis-first is not best understood as a foolish error. It is better understood as a stage in archaeological thinking. It brought order to a confusing record. It recognised a real and important ancient culture. It connected stone tools, extinct animals, ice age landscapes, and migration geography into a model that worked well enough for a while. But it also narrowed attention. It made older claims harder to accept. It encouraged a single route, single timeline view of a process that may have been far more complex. And once evidence from sites like Monte Verde, Paisley Caves, Rimrock Draw, White Sands, and others began to accumulate, the old model could no longer hold the whole story. There is something almost comforting in watching a scientific idea change this way. Not because certainty disappears, but because the world becomes larger. The first Americans were not simply a line of hunters stepping through an ice corridor at the appointed time. They may have been coastal travellers, desert foragers, inland hunters, families moving slowly through generations, people who knew landscapes now drowned or buried or eroded away. Some may have been ancestors of later populations. Some early movements may have left no descendants or no visible trace. Some routes may have been used more than once. The continent may not have been entered in a single grand arrival, but approached, explored, inhabited, lost, re-inhabited, and known in different ways across thousands of years. And somewhere within that longer, less tidy story, Clovis still matters. It marks a moment when a particular technology spread widely and left a strong archaeological signature. It shows us people who are capable, inventive, mobile, and deeply adapted to Ice Age North America. It gives us one of the clearest early windows into human life on the continent. But when we press our faces closer to the glass, we can now see shadows behind it. Older shadows, quieter ones, not as crisp as a fluted point under museum lights, but present all the same. And this is where Oregon begins to pull us in. Because in the dry caves near Paisley, the evidence did not arrive as a heroic spear point beside a mammoth. It arrived in a form much humbler, much stranger, and in some ways much more intimate. Traces of human life left behind in a cave, old enough to make the Clovis-first timeline shift uneasily in its chair. The caves near Paisley, Oregon do not look at first like the sort of place that would disturb a major scientific timeline. They are not towering monuments. They are not temples, pyramids, or ruins with carved stones waiting under vines. They are dry openings in a ridge of old volcanic rock, facing out across the wide basin country of south-central Oregon. The land around them can feel spacious in a way that makes modern noise seem temporary. Sagebrush, dust, basalt, old lake beds, and a sky large enough to make a person speak more quietly without quite knowing why. Today, this is a dry landscape, but during the late Ice Age it was tied to a wetter world, with larger lakes, cooler conditions, and animals that no longer live there. It is the kind of place where you can imagine people stopping not because it was dramatic, but because it was useful. Shelter matters, shade matters, a place out of the wind matters. Anyone who has ever been caught in unpleasant weather with no proper jacket will understand that archaeology often begins with very practical choices. Paisley Caves became important because they held on to things that most places lose. Dry caves can preserve organic materials that would decay quickly elsewhere. Fibres, seeds, bones, plant remains, and other fragile traces can survive when the conditions are kind enough, or perhaps stubborn enough. That is one reason caves and rock shelters are so valuable to archaeologists. They are not perfect time capsules, of course. Nothing in archaeology is perfect except perhaps the ability of dirt to get into your socks. Animals can enter caves. Water can move through sediments. Later people can disturb earlier layers. Rodents can dig, roots can creep, and sometimes the past behaves less like a neatly stacked archive and more like a cupboard that several generations have used without labelling anything. But when cave deposits are carefully excavated, dated and tested, they can preserve long sequences of human and environmental history in a way open-air sites often cannot. The first major work at Paisley Caves goes back to the early 20th century, when the University of Oregon archaeologist Luther Cressman investigated the region. Cressman was one of the important figures in Oregon archaeology, and he worked in a period when researchers were beginning to ask deeper questions about how long people had been in the Great Basin and the wider American West. But the evidence that would make Paisley famous much later came from renewed investigations led by Dennis Jenkins and colleagues from the University of Oregon in the early 2000s. They returned with modern methods, improved dating techniques, and the awareness that claims about very early occupation needed to be handled with unusual care. This is especially true in the Americas, where for so long the Clovis-first model had set the boundaries of acceptable timing. If a site seemed older than Clovis, it did not merely need to be interesting. It needed to survive a scientific cross-examination that would make most pebbles nervous. What they found was not the kind of evidence that usually fills the imagination when people think of ancient discovery. No golden mask, no carved statue, no spear frozen dramatically beside a mammoth with the ancient equivalent of suspense music rising in the background. Instead, one of the key pieces of evidence was coprolites, which is the formal word for preserved feces. It is a wonderfully serious term for something that still makes people smile. Archaeology, like life, has a way of reminding us that profound questions sometimes pass through very ordinary parts of being human. A coprolite can preserve chemical traces, DNA, pollen, diet, and clues about who or what left it behind. It is not glamorous, but then again, the past rarely asks what will look elegant in a museum display. At Paisley Caves, some of these coprolites were reported to contain ancient human mitochondrial DNA, and some were radiocarbon dated to around 14,300 to 14,400 years ago, roughly 1,000 years earlier than the traditional appearance of Clovis culture in North America. The University of Oregon summarized later work by saying that people were living at Paisley Caves as much as about 14,200 years ago, and that the results confirmed the Paisley coprolites as the oldest directly dated human remains in the Western Hemisphere. That is a quiet sentence with a large consequence. If people were in Oregon before Clovis, then Clovis could not be the first human presence across the continent. The old story did not vanish overnight, but it could no longer sit as comfortably as it once had. It helps to slow down and think about what that means. A few thousand years may sound small compared with the age of the Earth, or even the age of our species. But in this particular debate, 1,000 years is not a footnote. It is time for many generations to live, move, adapt, and leave traces. It is time for people to learn a landscape, return to a shelter, teach children where water can be found, follow animals through seasons, and notice which plants are useful, edible, or better left alone unless one is feeling unusually experimental. If humans were at Paisley Caves around 14,200 years ago, they were not appearing as a sudden, fully formed footnote just before Clovis. They were already part of a landscape, already making choices, already leaving biological traces in cave sediments. That suggests movement into the region had happened earlier still, because people do not usually arrive at a cave on the very first day a continent becomes available and immediately leave the oldest evidence archaeologists happen to find. The evidence was important, but it was also debated because science does not simply nod politely at ancient feces and move on. Some critics questioned whether the coprolites were truly human. Others raised the possibility that human DNA might have moved downward through sediments from later occupations, contaminating older material. DNA is powerful, but it is also delicate evidence. It can be mobile in sediments, and it can be affected by contamination. A cave is not a sealed laboratory drawer. It is a living geological space with moisture, animals, and repeated use over time, So the question became sharper. Were these really human coprolites from pre-Clovis layers, or were they animal coprolites that had somehow acquired younger human DNA? It is a less romantic question than who were the first Americans, but it is exactly the kind of careful question that makes archaeology stronger. Researchers returned to the problem using other lines of evidence. One major later study focused on fecal lipids, including sterols and bile acids, which are more chemically stable than DNA and less likely to move around through sediments. These compounds can help identify the kind of animal that produced a coprolite. The University of Oregon reported that this lipid work found that 3 of 6 coprolites previously identified as human by mitochondrial DNA were in fact human in origin, and that the study demonstrated some DNA movement may have occurred, while still supporting the conclusion that people were at Paisley Caves as much as 14,200 years ago. This is a good example of how science often moves forward, not by pretending criticism does not exist, and not by discarding evidence at the first objection, but by testing the weak points from another angle. If one line of evidence is questioned, another method can be brought in. If both point in the same direction, confidence grows. There is something rather fitting about the Paisley Caves story because it did not win its place through one dramatic object. It became persuasive through layers of evidence: stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, coprolites, DNA, lipids, artifacts, and careful debate. Stratigraphy is one of those archaeological words that sounds dry until you realize it is basically the discipline of listening to layers. Deeper layers are usually older than higher layers unless something has disturbed them. That "unless" is very important, and archaeologists spend a great deal of time looking for signs that the layers have been churned, washed, mixed, burrowed through, or otherwise rearranged by the world's least helpful assistants. At Paisley, researchers paid close attention to whether the sediments were intact and whether the dates made sense, in order from older to younger. Oregon State University reported that a major study collected more than 100 high-precision radiocarbon dates and examined the cave stratigraphy closely, with researchers arguing that human DNA-bearing coprolites were associated with well-dated sediment layers rather than later contamination. The caves also produced stone tools, and these added another layer to the problem. The tools found there were not Clovis points. They were associated with the Western stem tradition, a different early stone tool technology in the American West. Western stemmed projectile points have bases shaped differently from Clovis points. Instead of the famous Clovis flute, they have stemmed bases that could be hafted onto shafts or handles in another way. Oregon State University explained that Western stemmed points and Clovis points involved different technological strategies, with stemmed points having constricted bases and Clovis points being thinned at the base by removing a large flake. That may sound like a small technical matter, the kind of detail one might skip if sleepy. But in archaeology, how a tool is made can reveal relationships, traditions, teaching, and cultural difference. It is not just a sharp rock, it is a learned method. The presence of Western stemmed points at Paisley matters because it suggests that early people in the West were not simply a local branch of Clovis hunters using slightly different tools on a slow afternoon. They may represent a separate technological tradition, perhaps overlapping with Clovis in time, perhaps even beginning earlier. The Oregon State report described the Paisley points as dating to about 12,960 to 13,230 calendar years ago, while also noting that humans used the site as early as 13,200 calendar years ago, and perhaps as early as 14,700 calendar years ago. The dates and tool forms complicate the old idea that Clovis people were the single founding population spreading one technology across the continent. Instead, we may be looking at different groups, different adaptations, or different regional traditions existing at the same broad time. It is not one arrow anymore. It is several tracks crossing a much larger landscape. One of the easy mistakes when telling this story is to imagine the site as if it had only one moment. A person arrives. A coprolite is left. A scientist finds it. The timeline changes. Very tidy. Very convenient. Also, almost certainly not how the place worked. Paisley Caves were used across long spans of time. People and animals came and went. The cave deposits hold evidence from different periods, and the meaning comes from sorting those periods carefully, rather than flattening them into one exciting scene. Think of an old family attic, if the attic were made of sediment and also visited by extinct animals. Some things are ancient, some are newer, some belong together. Some only look like they belong together because they ended up in the same general place. The work is in telling which is which. The late Ice Age environment around Paisley would have been very different from the dry basin people see today. The northern Great Basin included lakes, wetlands, marshes, and rich ecotones where different habitats met. These were not empty deserts waiting for human arrival. They were productive landscapes with plants, birds, fish, small mammals, and larger animals moving through. Early people using Paisley Caves may have been taking advantage of that diversity. The coprolites and associated materials point to broad subsistence possibilities, not just a simple big game hunting story. That is another way Paisley quietly complicates the older model. Clovis-first often came packaged with the image of spear points and mammoths, and while large animals mattered in many early contexts, the human diet and survival strategy were usually more varied than a single heroic hunting scene. People eat what landscapes offer. They gather, fish, trap, hunt, process seeds, collect roots, and make use of seasonal abundance. It is less dramatic than a mammoth hunt perhaps, but far more likely to keep everyone fed through a long year. This is one reason the Paisley evidence feels so human. A spear point can symbolise hunting skill. A coprolite can tell us about digestion, diet, biology and presence. A fibre artefact may suggest mats, baskets, cordage or other woven technologies. The University of Oregon reported that a bulrush fibre artefact found in cave sediments was directly radiocarbon dated to roughly 14,000 years before present, helping confirm the stratigraphic integrity of the sediments and giving a direct date on a pre-Clovis cultural artefact. That small fragment of fibre is easy to overlook, but fibre technologies are among the most important and underpreserved parts of ancient life. Baskets, nets, mats, sandals, rope, bags and traps rarely last, yet they are essential. Stone tools get the attention because they survive, but fibre may have carried food, caught fish, covered bodies, lined shelters, and made daily life workable. The earliest Americans were not just point makers, they were makers of entire material worlds, most of which has disappeared. The controversy around Paisley also shows why archaeology is careful with claims about the first Americans. There's no shortage of possible early sites, but not all evidence is equally strong. Some old claims fade because the dating is weak. Some because the supposed tools turn out to be natural stones. Some because layers were disturbed. Paisley survived more of that scrutiny because researchers kept adding methods and addressing objections. The site did not become important by avoiding skepticism. It became important by passing through it. One of the researchers described the process as an example of how scientific dialogue operates, with skepticism driving new tests and multiple studies increasing confidence. That is a useful thing to remember, especially with a topic like this. Changing a human timeline is not a matter of finding one exciting object and declaring victory. It is more like slowly tightening a net of evidence until the old explanation can no longer slip through comfortably. Paisley Caves also change the emotional texture of the migration story. Clovis sites often evoke movement across large open spaces, hunters and animals, fast expansion, a technology spreading like sparks. Paisley feels different. It is quieter, a cave shelter, organic remains, a basin landscape, a trace of the body. It tells us not only that people may have been there before Clovis, but that they were using the land in ways that do not fit the old simple picture. These were people in the West, using a non-Clovis technology, present in a region that may connect to broader routes through the Great Basin, and perhaps to coastal movements beyond it. If early people came down the Pacific coast, moving inland along river corridors or through basins, Oregon would not be a side note. It would be part of the geography through which early human stories could have passed. Of course, Paisley does not answer everything. It does not tell us exactly when the first people entered North America. It does not reveal whether they came by coast, interior, or some combination. It does not tell us how many migration pulses there were, or whether the people at Paisley were directly ancestral to later populations. Archaeology rarely gives the whole answer from one site. What Paisley gives is something more specific and still very powerful. Evidence that the human presence in Oregon reaches back before the old Clovis-first boundary, and that early Western technologies were not simply Clovis with a regional accent. It gives us a fixed point that makes other possibilities more reasonable. Once one strong site breaks the old limit, other evidence can be considered with a different kind of openness, still cautious, but less constrained by the old assumption that anything pre-Clovis must be mistaken. Imagine, then, a person at Paisley Caves around 14,000 years ago. Not as a symbol of a theory, not as pre-Clovis in their own mind, because no one wakes up in the morning and thinks, I am currently living in a period that will be inconvenient for future archaeologists. They are simply there. The air is cool. The basin outside is alive with water and movement. There may be birds in marshes, animals passing through, plants to gather, stone to shape, fibre to twist, meals to prepare, tools to repair, children to watch. The cave is shelter, but not home in the modern fixed sense. It is a place in a round of movement, a known spot in a known landscape. People talk, someone laughs, someone is tired, someone is hungry, someone probably cannot find a tool they set down 5 minutes earlier, proving again that the human condition is very old, and then most of it vanishes. The voices vanish first, the footsteps go, the fires burn out, the fibres decay unless conditions are unusually kind. Bones break, dust settles, the lake changes, the climate shifts, animals disappear, thousands of years pass. Then archaeologists arrive with trowels, bags, notes, gloves, radiocarbon samples, and the cautious excitement of people who know that a very small object can cause a very large argument. From the outside, it may seem strange that so much can depend on something as humble as a coprolite or a fibre fragment, but that is how deep history often works. It does not always speak through grand ruins. Sometimes it clears its throat through a scrap. The quiet trouble of Paisley Caves is that the evidence does not behave the way the old timeline expected. It does not point to Clovis as the sole beginning. It does not present the first Americans as one uniform wave of fluted point hunters moving through one inland corridor. Instead, it shows a more complicated West, with early people, different tools, organic technologies, and a presence old enough to make the standard story shift. Paisley did not end the debate over the peopling of the Americas, but it helped change the rules of the debate. It made the pre-Clovis world harder to dismiss. It encouraged researchers to look at old sites with new methods and new sites with a wider imagination. It also reminded everyone that the earliest traces may not look like what we expected to find. And once Oregon had offered that kind of evidence from the caves, another Oregon site began to pull the timeline even farther back, out beyond Paisley's already uncomfortable dates, and into an older horizon. This one was not tucked inside a cave with preserved coprolites and fibres, but in a rock shelter near an ancient lake basin, where stone tools, volcanic ash, and extinct animal remains began to form a different kind of problem. Paisley had made the old Clovis-first model uneasy. Rimrock Draw would ask whether the human story in Oregon might reach back even deeper. Rimrock Draw begins with a setting that feels almost too modest for the size of the question it asks. It lies outside Riley, Oregon, in the open country of Harney County. beneath a shallow overhang of rock where the land is wide, dry, and very good at making human lives seem brief. If Paisley Caves gave us a quiet biological trace, something intimate and preserved in darkness, Rimrock Draw gives us a different kind of trouble. It gives us a tool, stone flakes, extinct animal remains, old volcanic ash, and dates that seem to lean back beyond the comfortable edge of the old story. Not a complete answer, not a neat announcement from the ground saying, here is exactly when people arrived, because archaeology is rarely that considerate. But it gives us enough to pause, enough to look at the old Clovis-first timeline and notice that its seams are stretching again. The site is a rock shelter rather than a deep cave, and that matters. A rock shelter is a practical place. It does not have to be grand. It only has to protect people from wind, sun, rain, or cold for long enough to be useful. A shallow overhang in an open landscape can become a work area, a rest stop, a lookout, a place where tools are sharpened, meat is processed, hides are scraped, and stories are exchanged before people move on. The University of Oregon's Archaeological Field School, led by archaeologist Patrick O'Grady, has been excavating at Rimrock Draw since 2011 in partnership with the Bureau of Land Management, and the work has uncovered stone tools along with fragments of teeth from extinct Pleistocene animals, including camel and bison. That combination alone is enough to make the site interesting. Stone tools tell us someone was shaping or using stone. Extinct animals tell us the deposits belong to a vanished Ice Age world. The question, as always, is whether those things belong together in time, in space, and in meaning. Archaeology depends heavily on context. A stone tool by itself is a human object, yes, but a stone tool found in a disturbed layer may not tell you when it was made or used. A dated animal tooth nearby may not matter if the tool moved there later. Volcanic ash can be a blessing because it sometimes provides a clear marker in the ground, a layer that fell across a landscape at a known time. But even then, one has to ask what lies above it, what lies below it, and whether the sediments have remained in order. This is where Rimrock Draw becomes important. In 2012, O'Grady's team found camel tooth fragments beneath a layer of volcanic ash from a Mount St. Helens eruption dated to more than 15,000 years ago, and below that ash they also found a finely crafted orange agate scraper, with later reporting noting that the natural layering suggested the scrapers were older than both the ash and the camel teeth. A tool underneath a very old ash layer is the sort of thing that quietly clears its throat in the middle of a timeline discussion. That orange agate tool is at the heart of the story. It is not a dramatic fluted Clovis point, not the kind of object that immediately fits the old museum image of the first Americans as mammoth hunters with a signature weapon. It is a scraper, a working tool, the sort of object used for tasks that may sound ordinary but would have been central to daily survival. Scraping hides, cutting, butchering, perhaps working wood or other materials. Ordinary tools are often the ones that tell the most honest stories. A projectile point can make us think of a single exciting moment. A scraper suggests work, repeated work, someone holding stone in hand, pressing, cutting, cleaning, preparing, maintaining the practical world of food, warmth, clothing, shelter and tools. If Clovis points have the elegance of a sharpened idea, a scraper has the patience of a chore, and the past was full of chores. The past, one suspects, was very rarely impressed by anyone's desire for drama. The dating is what makes Rimrock Draw so challenging. Radiocarbon analysis of tooth enamel, first in 2018 and again in 2023, produced a date of about 18,250 years before present, or about 14,900 radiocarbon years, for the animal remains associated with the same deep levels where stone tools and flakes were found. The University of Oregon described the 15,000-year-old volcanic ash as a shock, and the 18,000-year-old enamel dates, with stone tools and flakes below, as even more startling. That word, startling, is a careful academic way of saying that the ground had become inconvenient again. If the association is correct, then humans were using Rimrock Draw more than 18,000 years ago, long before Clovis, and deep into a time when older models did not comfortably place people in Oregon. It is worth being careful here, because Rimrock Draw is not the same kind of evidence as the White Sands footprints, where human tracks themselves are preserved. It is not the same as a directly dated human bone, and it is not a written confession from an Ice Age traveller saying, "Yes, I made this tool on Tuesday." The claim depends on the relationship between the tools, the dated animal remains, and the sediment layers. That does not make it weak automatically. Much archaeology works this way, but it does mean the evidence must be evaluated through stratigraphy, dating, artifact analysis, and further excavation. The BLM's own language says the site provides evidence suggesting human occupation more than 18,000 years ago, which is the right tone. Not timid, but not reckless. Archaeology advances best when it walks with a lantern rather than a trumpet. Still, even a cautious suggestion can be powerful. An 18,250-year date in association with stone tools would push human activity in Oregon far beyond the older Clovis-first expectation. It would also place people in the northern Great Basin during a period when the continent was still strongly shaped by Ice Age conditions. The Great Ice Sheet still controlled much of the north. Sea levels were lower, landscapes were different. Animal communities included species now gone. Camelops, the extinct North American camel, was part of that world. So were ancient bison, and many other animals whose names now sound as if they belong to museums rather than weather, dust, hunger, and actual footsteps. But they were not museum creatures then. They were part of the living landscape, and if humans were at Rimrock Draw, then people were not merely arriving after the Ice Age world had already faded. They were moving within it. That detail matters because the old Clovis-first model often placed people in North America near the end of the last Ice Age, just in time for the Great Clovis expansion. Rimrock Draw asks us to imagine something earlier. Not a continent already opening into familiar post-glacial habitats, but a more difficult, shifting world. The people who may have used the rock shelter were not waiting for our preferred timeline to begin. They were adapting to whatever the land offered. Animals, plants, water, stone, shelter, seasonal movement. They may have known lake basins and marsh edges, uplands and ridges, good stone sources and dangerous weather. They may have returned to certain places repeatedly, not because those places were famous, but because they worked. A rock shelter becomes important through use, not all at once, but through small repeated decisions. Stop here, work here, rest here, leave something behind. The orange agate scraper also reminds us that early human life was not only about arrival. The phrase, peopling of the Americas, can make the entire story sound like a map problem. Where did they enter? Which route? What date? Which arrow goes where? But people do not experience their lives as arrows. They experience them as tasks. The tool in the ground may represent hide-working, butchery, woodworking, or some other practical activity. It may have touched an animal. It may have been resharpened. It may have been carried for some distance before being lost or left. One of the scrapers found at the site was reported to have preserved bison blood residue, which suggests a direct connection to animal processing, though residue analysis, like all specialised evidence, has to be interpreted with care. Even so, the image is grounded and physical. A person using stone against hide or flesh. Hands working at the edge of survival. Not an abstract migration, but a meal, a covering, a tool, a need. And this is where the site becomes strangely intimate despite being known mostly through technical details. A tool that should not be there, according to the old timeline, is not just a scientific inconvenience. It is a reminder that people may have been living full, practical lives in places where our theories once left blank space. Blank space on a map is never truly blank. It is only blank to the person drawing the map. The land itself has always been full of animals, water, plants, weather, stone, insects, paths, and perhaps earlier than once believed, human choices. Rimrock Draw does not ask us to imagine a large population. It does not require cities, villages, monuments, or anything grand. It asks only that we allow the possibility of people passing through, using shelter, making tools, and interacting with Ice Age animals in Oregon more than 18,000 years ago. That is already enough to change the scale of the story. There is another part of the Rimrock Draw evidence that makes it especially useful in this wider discussion: volcanic ash. Ash layers can serve almost like bookmarks in the sediment. A volcano erupts. Ash falls across the landscape. Over time, more sediment accumulates above it. If archaeologists can identify and date that ash, then materials below it must generally be older, assuming the layers are undisturbed. At Rimrock Draw, the relevant ash has been associated with a Mount St. Helens eruption dated to more than 15,000 years ago, and the tool and other materials below that ash therefore sit beneath a strong chronological marker. This does not magically solve every question, because sediment can be complicated, and archaeology enjoys complications the way a wool sweater enjoys collecting burrs. But it gives the site a geological structure that researchers can test, refine, and debate. The mention of Mount St. Helens also quietly connects this deep history to landscapes that people in the Pacific Northwest still know today. Volcanoes are not background decoration in this region. They shape valleys, bury surfaces, create ash layers, alter rivers, and leave time markers across huge areas. Indigenous oral histories in the region have long preserved memories of geological events, and University of Oregon reporting on Rimrock Draw included comments from scholar David Lewis, noting that the early dates align with regional tribal oral histories about events such as the Missoula floods and encounters with giant animals. This does not mean oral tradition and archaeology are the same kind of evidence. They are different ways of carrying knowledge, but it does remind us that scientific timelines are not the only timelines people have held. For many indigenous communities, the idea of deep presence in these landscapes is not a surprising new headline. It is part of much older continuity. That is an important point to handle with respect. Archaeology has often spoken about discovering human antiquity in places where living peoples have long maintained histories of belonging. A radiocarbon date can be new to science without the deeper relationship being new to the people of the region. When a site like Rimrock Draw pushes an archaeological timeline back, it may feel revolutionary in academic terms, but it can also sit alongside indigenous traditions that never imagine the connection to the land as shallow or recent. Science is not diminished by acknowledging that. It becomes better behaved, a little less likely to burst into a room, announcing it has found something everyone else was apparently supposed to be astonished by. One might say archaeology is still learning to knock. The broader scientific significance of Rimrock Draw comes from where it sits in relation to other early Western sites. Oregon already had Paisley Caves, with evidence of people before Clovis. Idaho has Cooper's Ferry, where evidence indicates occupation more than 16,000 years ago. And the BLM noted that Cooper's Ferry has been considered one of the oldest known habitation sites in Western North America. Rimrock Draw, if its earliest interpretation continues to hold, pushes the Western record still farther back. That does not mean all these sites belong to one culture or one route. It means the western interior of North America was not a late, empty stage waiting for Clovis people to appear. It may have been part of much older human geography, one connected to river systems, lake basins, high deserts, and perhaps movements from the Pacific coast inland. The possibility of coastal migration is never far from this discussion. If people were in Oregon and Idaho before or around the time the inland ice-free corridor was fully viable, then a Pacific coastal route becomes more plausible, or at least harder to ignore. People could have moved along shorelines, estuaries, and kelp-rich marine environments, then followed rivers or interior basins inland. The problem, again, is that the late Pleistocene coastline is not where the modern coastline is. Sea levels have risen, drowning many places where early camps may have stood. This makes inland sites like Rimrock Draw especially valuable. They may preserve clues from people whose coastal routes, stopping places and shore camps have been hidden by the ocean. It is as if the sea has quietly taken custody of half the evidence, and left archaeologists to negotiate with tides, sediment and underwater survey equipment. The sea so far has not been especially talkative, but Rimrock Draw is not only about rote, it is also about the diversity of early technologies. The old Clovis-first picture gave enormous importance to one tool form, the fluted point. Rimrock Draw belongs to a world where early human evidence may appear in different technological packages. Scrapers, flakes, debitage, stemmed points elsewhere, fibre artefacts, hearths, residues, and other traces all matter. A person does not become archaeologically invisible simply because they did not make Clovis points. This seems obvious when said plainly, but it took time for the field to fully absorb. Archaeology often sees what survives best and what researchers are trained to recognise. For decades, Clovis points were so visible and so widespread that they became a kind of lens. Sites without them could seem later, lesser or uncertain. Rimrock Draw contributes to a different lens, one in which pre-Clovis and non-Clovis technologies are taken seriously when their contexts and dates support them. One can imagine the moment of finding that orange tool beneath the ash, not in a cinematic way, with music swelling and everyone suddenly understanding the future of the field. More likely it involved careful excavation, recording, measuring, bagging, and a very controlled kind of excitement, because field archaeologists are trained not to leap around inside fragile deposits, even when the ground is being extremely interesting. Still, there must have been a feeling in it. A tool below an ash layer older than Clovis, then dated tooth enamel, then more testing, then the slow realisation that the site might be pointing toward human occupation much earlier than the old model allowed. Archaeology often moves through small physical actions: scrape, brush, note, photograph, sample, label. But sometimes those small actions open a large door. The phrase, "the tool that shouldn't be there," does not mean the tool is impossible. It means it does not belong comfortably inside an older expectation. That is different. In science, impossible things usually become errors. Uncomfortable things become discoveries if they survive testing. Rimrock Draw is uncomfortable in the productive sense. It forces questions. Was the layer intact? Are the dates reliable? Are the tools clearly human-made? What is the relationship between the artifacts and the animal remains? Can more dates confirm the sequence? Do additional excavations show the same pattern? These are not attempts to dismiss the site. They are how the site becomes stronger. If the evidence is real, it can endure questions. If it is not, the questions will find the weakness. Either outcome teaches us something, though one is admittedly more exciting and has better chances of appearing in a headline. There is also a useful lesson in the difference between oldest and oldest known. News stories often love the word oldest tool, oldest site, oldest evidence. It is a powerful word, very good at attracting attention, rather like a raccoon discovering a shiny spoon. But in archaeology, oldest known is always temporary. It means oldest found so far, oldest dated so far, oldest accepted so far, oldest in a specific region or category. Rimrock Draw may be one of the oldest human occupation sites in North America if the interpretation holds, but White Sands has evidence of human footprints older still, and other sites across the Americas continue to complicate the picture. The point is not to crown one place as the winner of deep time. The point is to recognise the pattern. The earliest accepted human presence keeps moving farther back, and the old single-entry model keeps losing its neat edges. Rimrock Draw also helps us think about what people were doing in these landscapes, rather than simply when they arrived. The presence of extinct camel and bison remains suggests an ecosystem rich enough to attract both animals and humans. If people were processing animals there, they were participating in Ice Age food webs, not as visitors from outside nature, but as another highly adaptable species in a changing environment. They likely understood animal behaviour, seasonal movement, stone sources, weather patterns, and the value of shelter. They may have hunted some animals, scavenged others, gathered plants, and used whatever resources made sense. The idea of early people as only big game hunters has always been too narrow. Humans are flexible. We are not only the animal with the spear, we are also the animal with the basket, the digging stick, the fishing line, the story, the fire, and the uncanny ability to turn almost any environment into a complicated list of errands. To sit with Rimrock Draw is to sit with uncertainty that is not empty. It is not the uncertainty of having no evidence. It is the uncertainty of evidence that must be interpreted with care. There are tools, there are dates, there is ash. There are extinct animal remains. There is a possible early human presence. The site has not closed the debate, but it has earned its place in the conversation. And its location in Oregon matters because Oregon is becoming one of the important regions where the old timeline is being stretched. Paisley Caves offered pre-Clovis human traces in a dry cave setting. Rimrock Draw may push occupation much earlier through a rock shelter sequence. Together they suggest that the northern Great Basin was not peripheral to the earliest human story in North America. It may have been a region of movement, adaptation, and repeated use during a much older period than once assumed. The landscape itself helps explain why. The Great Basin during the late Pleistocene was not simply a barren desert. Pluvial lakes filled many basins, wetlands and marshes created productive habitats, animals moved through open country, obsidian and other stone materials were available in some regions. Caves and rock shelters offered shelter and preservation. People moving through such landscapes would have found both challenges and opportunities. Water sources could shift, seasons could be harsh. But where lakes, marshes, animals, and stone came together, people would have noticed. Human beings are very good at noticing useful places. We mark them in memory, we return to them, we tell others. In time, a useful place becomes an archaeological site, though no one living there would have called it that. They would have called it something else if they named it at all. A place to stop, a place with shade, a place where animals pass, a place where the stone is good, a place where someone once lost a tool and unknowingly caused a great deal of future professional discussion. The shouldn't be there feeling also reveals how much our timelines depend on expectation. If researchers in the early 20th century had first found several strong sites older than Clovis, then Clovis might have been understood from the beginning as one important later development among many. But because Clovis evidence appeared early, clearly and widely, it became the baseline. That baseline shaped decades of interpretation. Rimrock Draw is part of the long process of undoing that baseline, not by replacing it with a careless claim that people were everywhere at every time, but by showing that some places hold evidence older than the old model predicted. The correction is not from certainty to chaos. It is from a simple certainty to a more complex evidence-based uncertainty, which is often where real understanding begins. Picture the rock shelter in its older world. The overhang casts shade. The land beyond it is not identical to today's desert, but a basin shaped by ice age climate, water, animals, and seasonal change. A person sits with a piece of orange agate. Maybe the tool is already old to them, carried and reused. Maybe it was made nearby. Maybe someone uses it against hide or flesh, then sets it down. Perhaps it is lost in dust. Perhaps it is discarded because another tool is better. Time passes. Ash from a volcano falls and settles. More sediment covers the surface. Animals come and go. Teeth break, weather, or are left behind. The people vanish from view, not because they were unimportant, but because most of human life leaves only the faintest mark. Thousands of years later, careful hands uncover the stone again and discover that it sits below a layer where, according to the old story, it was not supposed to be. That is the real power of Rimrock Draw. It does not need to be loud. It only needs to be in order. A tool beneath ash. Animal remains with dates. Flakes in deep layers. A pattern that suggests people were present earlier than the old timeline allowed. The site is still being studied, and additional testing of animal fragments and plant remains from cooking fires has been reported as ongoing. That means the story is not finished. Future work may strengthen the case, refine the dates, complicate the interpretation, or reveal something no one has yet thought to ask. Archaeology is like that. Every answer comes with sediment attached. From Paisley Caves to Rimrock Draw, Oregon gives us two different kinds of early evidence, and together they make the old Clovis-first story feel less like a foundation, and more like one visible layer in a deeper deposit. Paisley's traces were intimate and biological, preserved in dry cave sediments. Rimrock's challenge comes through tools, ash, enamel and stratigraphy. One site says people were there before Clovis, the other may say they were there much earlier still. And once the mind makes room for that possibility, the map of early North America begins to change. The routes become more varied. The timing becomes deeper. The people become less like a single migration wave and more like communities moving through different landscapes over long spans of time. Then the evidence becomes even harder to ignore, because in New Mexico the ground did something rare. It did not simply preserve tools or bones that had to be argued into human context. It preserved human feet. Not one vague mark, not a doubtful stone, but trackways crossing ancient mud in a basin that once held water, children, adults, animals, and ordinary movement. If Rimrock Draw asks whether a tool can push Oregon's story back beyond expectation, White Sands asks what happens when people leave the shape of their own bodies in the ground, and the dates point to a time when the old timeline should not have allowed them to be there at all. White Sands is one of those places where the surface of the earth seems almost too bright to be old. The dunes are pale, soft and shifting, a great sweep of gypsum sand in southern New Mexico that looks, at first glance, like a landscape made fresh each morning. Wind moves the dunes, light changes them by the hour. Footprints made by modern visitors can vanish quickly, erased by weather with the casual efficiency of a housekeeper who does not appreciate archaeology. And yet, beneath and around those shifting dunes, the ground has kept some of the most unsettling human evidence in North America. Not a stone point, not a hearth, not a bone with cut marks that must be argued over in cautious academic language. Footprints, human footprints, pressed into ancient mud near the margins of a vanished Ice Age lake, then buried, preserved, and revealed again after more than 20,000 years. White Sands National Park describes the tracks as fossilized footprints scattered across the old Lake Otero Basin, a landscape that existed before the modern dunes and held evidence of ancient human and animal movement. Footprints are different from artifacts. A tool can travel. A stone point might be carried far from where it was made. A bone can move through water, sediment, animal activity, or geological disturbance. But a footprint is tied to a moment of contact. Someone's foot met wet ground, weight pressed down, toes spread slightly, a heel sank in. Then the foot lifted and the person moved on. It is simple, physical, and difficult to make abstract. A footprint does not tell a person's name, language, family, or destination, but it does tell us something that feels almost startlingly direct. They were there. Not symbolically, not as a theory. There, with weight and movement, and probably mud between the toes. For anyone who spends too much time thinking about migration models, tool typologies, and radiocarbon calibration curves, a footprint is a useful reminder that the past was lived by bodies. During the time these tracks were made, White Sands was not the dry gypsum desert we see today. It was part of a wetter Ice Age basin, with Lake Otero and surrounding wetlands creating a landscape where people, mammoths, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, camels, and other animals moved through the same broad region. The National Park Service notes that the modern white dunes are geologically recent compared with the older lake bed surfaces where fossilized footprints are found. That matters because it changes the picture in the mind. We should not imagine ancient people wandering across today's brilliant dunes under the same dry sky. We should imagine lake margins, wet mud, shallow water, reeds, grasses and animals, drawn to the dependable resources of a basin that was not empty at all. It was a working landscape, a place to gather, hunt, watch, carry, avoid predators, and move between tasks. In other words, not a dramatic stage built for future discovery, but an ordinary place where ordinary movement became extraordinary evidence. The first widely reported dating of the White Sands human footprints placed them roughly between 23,000 and 21,000 years ago, based on radiocarbon dating of seeds of the aquatic plant Ruppia, found in layers associated with the tracks. The National Park Service describes research indicating that humans were present in the Tularosa Basin at least 23,000 years ago, with calibrated seed dates around 22,860 and 21,130 years ago in the footprint-bearing sequence. That date range landed like a heavy object on the old Clovis-first story. It was not simply a few centuries earlier, it was thousands of years earlier. It placed people in what is now New Mexico during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets were near their greatest extent, and the traditional interior corridor route was not supposed to have offered an easy path into the continent. If the dates were right, humans were deep in North America long before the old timeline had cleared room for them. That is why the dating became the centre of intense debate. The issue was not whether the footprints looked human. The tracks themselves have been widely accepted as human tracks. The harder question was their age. The original dates came from Ruppia seeds, and aquatic plants can create problems for radiocarbon dating, because they may absorb old carbon dissolved in water, which can make them appear older than they really are. The USGS explained that this reservoir effect was the central criticism of the first White Sands dates, since plants living in water can take in dissolved carbon rather than carbon from the air. This is exactly the kind of complication that makes archaeology both fascinating and occasionally exhausting. The footprint says someone was there. The seed says when. Then the seed is asked, very politely but firmly, whether it has been telling the whole truth. Because the claim was so important, researchers did not leave it resting on one kind of evidence. A later study published in Science used independent dating methods to test the original age range, including radiocarbon dating of conifer pollen, and optically stimulated luminescence dating of quartz grains from the same sequence, and reported that those independent estimates supported the roughly 23,000 to 21,000 year age of the footprints. The USGS summarised the 2023 work by saying that 2 new lines of evidence confirmed the age of the oldest fossil human footprints in North America. This was important because pollen from terrestrial plants is less vulnerable to the aquatic reservoir problem, and luminescence dating measures when mineral grains were last exposed to sunlight before burial. Different materials, different methods, similar result. In science, that kind of agreement does not make every question vanish, but it does make the evidence much harder to wave away with a single objection. Then more support arrived. Research reported in 2025 added radiocarbon dating of ancient wetland muds and lake sediments, with results between about 20,700 and 22,400 years ago, again broadly consistent with the earlier White Sands timeline. Reuters reported that this newer work reinforced the case that humans occupied the area during the last ice age, while also noting that the tracks represent movement through the landscape, rather than proof of a permanent settlement. That last distinction is worth holding on to. White Sands gives us movement, it gives us presence. It gives us bodies crossing mud. It does not necessarily give us a village, a camp, or a long-term habitation site in the way a rock shelter might. People may have passed through repeatedly, worked along the lake edge, carried things, hunted, gathered, watched animals, or moved between safer places. The footprints show activity, not architecture. They show life in motion. And life in motion is exactly what makes White Sands so powerful. Some trackways appear to have been made by children and teenagers, others were left by adults. There are human tracks near animal tracks, including mammoths and giant ground sloths. In some cases, tracks overlap or interact in ways that allow researchers to reconstruct sequences of movement. A person walks one way, An animal crosses later. A sloth changes direction near human tracks. A mammoth steps through. The result is not a still image of ancient life, but something closer to a landscape with multiple sentences written across it at different times. Not a story in words exactly, but a story in pressure, stride length, direction, and mud. It is easy to imagine the mud soft underfoot, unpleasant perhaps, sucking slightly at each step. Anyone who has walked across a wet field in bad shoes knows that mud has a personality. It keeps what it likes and releases what it must. One of the most striking trackways from White Sands, described in earlier research, appears to show a person travelling in a straight line across the playa, possibly carrying a child, then returning later without the same load. At points along the way, small child footprints appear beside the adult trackway, as if the child was set down briefly. The details are debated and interpreted carefully, but the image is deeply human. An adult carrying a child across wet ground, stopping, setting the child down, picking them up again, continuing. It is not the kind of scene that appears in the old Clovis-first picture, where the first Americans are often represented by hunters, points, and mammoths. It is more domestic, more tiring, more familiar. Someone had a child to move from one place to another, and if that does not count as a recognisable human problem, little does. White Sands also makes the peopling of the Americas feel less like an event and more like a lived process. If people were in New Mexico between about 23,000 and 21,000 years ago, then they must have arrived in the Americas earlier than that, perhaps much earlier. They did not teleport to the Tularosa Basin. Populations take time to move, adapt, grow, split, and spread. Routes take generations to learn. Landscapes must be crossed, and people must survive along the way. That is one reason the White Sands dates are so disruptive. They do not merely add an older dot to the map. They require time before the dot. Time for entry, movement, exploration, and adaptation. The footprints are the mark we see, but they imply an unseen history stretching behind them. This is where the old Bering land bridge story begins to change shape again. Beringia itself remains important. Most evidence still supports a broad connection between indigenous American ancestors and populations in Northeast Asia, and Beringia was likely central to that deep history. But the route from Beringia into the rest of the Americas may not have been a single inland corridor opening neatly at the correct time. If White Sands is correctly dated to the last glacial maximum, then some people were already far south of the ice sheets, while the classic ice-free corridor model was still difficult to reconcile with the timing. That pushes attention toward earlier coastal movement, or perhaps more complex movement through landscapes not yet fully understood. The Pacific coast, now partly drowned by rising postglacial seas, becomes especially important. It may have offered a route rich in marine foods, and less blocked by ice in some areas, though the evidence is hard to find because many ancient shorelines now lie underwater. White Sands does not prove the coastal route by itself. It is not on the coast, and footprints in New Mexico cannot tell us exactly how people entered the continent. But it changes what kinds of routes become necessary to consider. If humans were that far south that early, then the route must be compatible with that timing. A later opening inland corridor alone becomes harder to rely on as the whole explanation. A coastal route by boat, perhaps combined with the inland movement along rivers and basins, becomes more than a side suggestion. It becomes one of the few ways to make the geography and chronology sit at the same table without glaring at each other. This is one of those moments where the absence of evidence along ancient coastlines is not the same as evidence of absence. The sea has risen, shorelines have shifted, campsites that once stood near kelp forests, estuaries, beaches and river mouths may now be submerged. The most important evidence may be offshore, under sediment or simply gone. Still, the inland location of White Sands is part of what makes it so valuable. It shows that people were not merely clinging to one edge of the continent. They were present in the interior southwest using wetland environments during a cooler, wetter period. The Tularosa Basin would have offered resources very different from a frozen northern route or a modern desert. Wetlands are rich places. They attract animals. They support plants, birds, fish, and small mammals. They provide reeds, fibres, food, water, and mud, which is less convenient for walking but excellent for preserving footprints under the right conditions. For hunter-gatherers, a lake margin can be a busy world. Not necessarily easy, because no ancient landscape should be imagined as a pleasant nature retreat with snacks provided, but rich enough to draw repeated activity. The tracks also help correct a subtle bias in how early human history is often imagined. Stone tools tend to foreground adult male hunting in the modern imagination, even when the evidence itself does not demand such a narrow view. Footprints widen the cast, children appear, teenagers appear, adults appear in movement. Bodies of different sizes move through the same landscape. Some tracks suggest repeated crossings by younger individuals, perhaps doing tasks near the lake margin. This does not mean we can reconstruct an entire social system from footprints alone. We should be careful not to place too much modern imagination into every track. But the presence of children and adolescents matters. It reminds us that migration was not carried out by lone hunters striding across a continent with heroic focus. It involved families, dependents, learning, play, fatigue, care, danger, and the daily business of keeping a group alive. That may be one of White Sands' greatest contributions. It makes early people ordinary again, in the best sense. They were not merely representatives of a migration event. They were people walking through mud, sometimes with children, sometimes near animals, sometimes leaving tracks that crossed and overlapped. Their lives were complex enough to include work, movement, caution, and probably distraction. A child at the edge of an Ice Age lake may not have understood that the mud beneath their feet would one day disturb a 20th century archaeological model. They may have been thinking about water, insects, a parent's voice, an animal nearby, or the simple pleasure of stepping in soft ground. Children, even in deep time, were very likely still children. The preservation of the tracks required a fortunate sequence of events. Wet ground had to be firm enough to hold shape but soft enough to receive impressions. The tracks had to dry or be stabilised. They had to be covered before erosion destroyed them. Later sediments had to protect them. Then, much later, erosion had to reveal them again without wiping them away entirely. It is a narrow path between disappearance and discovery. Most footprints in human history lasted seconds, minutes, perhaps days. The White Sands tracks lasted tens of thousands of years. That is not because the people who made them were trying to send us a message. It is because geology accidentally became a witness. And what a witness it is. A stone tool can sometimes be argued over, human-made or naturally broken, in place or moved, older or younger than its layer. Footprints bring different questions. Are they human? How old are they? What layers surround them? What dated materials bracket them? The debate at White Sands has focused heavily on age because the tracks themselves are so plainly connected to living bodies. This gives the evidence an emotional immediacy that many early sites lack. You can imagine standing beside one of those prints and placing your own foot near it. Not on it, of course, because the National Park Service would quite reasonably prefer that you not personally ruin deep history, but near it, heel to heel across 20,000 years. The shape is familiar. The time is not. White Sands also changes the scale of North American history in public imagination. For decades, the idea that people arrived around 13,000 years ago was repeated so often that it became a kind of default. Then pre-Clovis sites began pushing the date older. Monteverde in Chile, Paisley Caves in Oregon, Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, and others. Each one widened the window. But White Sands pushed into a period that is especially hard for the old model because it falls during the last glacial maximum. If people were in New Mexico then, the first entry into the Americas must be earlier still, possibly enough earlier that archaeologists must look for evidence in places now submerged, deeply buried, or not yet considered promising. That is a major change. It does not just adjust a number, it changes where researchers look, what they expect, and how they evaluate the silence of the record. There remains caution, as there should. Some researchers continue to scrutinise the dating and the geological context. Big claims attract careful criticism, and White Sands is a big claim. But the evidence has become stronger as independent methods have been added, and the site is now one of the central pieces in the argument that humans were in North America well before Clovis. The 2023 science study and later work using additional materials did not end every debate, but they made the early age much more difficult to dismiss as a simple dating error. This is how a scientific revolution often looks in practice. Not a single shout, but repeated measurements, methods, replies, refinements, and the slow changing of what experts consider plausible. For the people who made the footprints, none of this existed. No Clovis-first model, no journal articles, no arguments over aquatic reservoir effects, no careful comparison of pollen, quartz grains, seeds and mud. They walked because walking was necessary. They crossed a lake margin because something was on the other side, or because this was simply part of moving through a known place. Behind them, the mud held their passing for a moment, then another moment, then many thousands of years. The old lake dried, the dunes came, the climate changed, the animals vanished. Human societies across the Americas transformed in countless ways. Languages rose and disappeared. Traditions shifted. Descendants lived, migrated, settled, adapted, and remembered through their own histories. And still the prints remained, hidden beneath a landscape that looked new. There is something grounding about that. White Sands does not ask us to imagine human arrival as a grand entrance. It asks us to imagine footsteps, small ones, large ones, hurried ones, steady ones. It asks us to remember that the earliest evidence for people in a place may not be a weapon or a campfire, but the simple fact of bodies moving through the world. In the old Clovis-first story, humans entered North America near the end of the Ice Age and quickly spread with a recognisable technology. In the White Sands story, people are already far to the south much earlier, during a time when the traditional route struggles to explain their presence. That does not solve the mystery, but it deepens it in a way that feels honest. The continent was not first touched by humans at the moment the most visible stone tools appeared. It had already been crossed by feet, and once you accept that, the map becomes quieter and larger. Oregon's Paisley Caves and Rimrock Draw show traces that do not sit neatly inside the old frame. White Sands gives those traces company from farther south, and much deeper in time. Together they suggest that the first human story in North America may have been older, more varied, and more difficult to see than the bright certainty of Clovis points once allowed. But then there is another site, one that does not merely push beyond Clovis, or even comfortably pre-Clovis. It reaches so far back that many researchers hesitate at the threshold. It asks whether broken mastodon bones and heavy stones in California could signal human activity at an age that seems almost impossible beside the accepted timeline. White Sands made the earlier presence of humans feel visible underfoot. The Cerutti Mastodon site asks what happens when the evidence is not footprints at all, but shattered bone, stone, force, and a date so old it makes the whole room go quiet. By the time this story reaches Southern California, the human timeline has already become less tidy than it used to be. Paisley Caves has given us traces of people in Oregon before Clovis. Rimrock Draw has suggested a still older possibility in the same broad region. White Sands has placed human footprints in New Mexico between about 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. Those are major shifts, the sort that make the old classroom arrow from Beringia look far less confident than it once did. But the Cerutti Mastodon site does something different. It does not simply step a little farther back. It walks into the room, places a stack of broken mastodon bones on the table and asks whether everyone is prepared to discuss a date of around 130,000 years ago. That is not a small adjustment. That is not even a large adjustment. That is the sort of claim that makes archaeologists take off their glasses, clean them carefully, and then put them back on to make sure they read it correctly. The site was found in San Diego County, California, during construction work connected to a freeway expansion in November of 1992. It was named after Richard Cerutti, the paleontologist who discovered it, and it was excavated over the following months by paleontologists from the San Diego Natural History Museum. What they uncovered was the partial skeleton of a mastodon, including broken bones and teeth, found with several large stones that the original research team later interpreted as possible hammerstones and anvils. The museum describes the discovery as sharply broken mastodon fossils found alongside 5 large stones that appeared to have been used as hammers and anvils. On the surface, that may sound like the beginning of an ordinary Ice Age paleontology story. A construction site reveals ancient animal remains. Scientists arrive. Bones are collected. A museum gains another window into a vanished ecosystem. But the Cerutti site did not stay safely inside paleontology. It crossed into archaeology because of one question. Were those bones broken by natural processes or by hominins using stones? That word, hominins, is important. The original claim was not simply that modern humans, Homo sapiens, were definitely living in California 130,000 years ago. The claim was broader and more unsettling, that some unidentified species of Homo, some human relative with manual skill and the knowledge to use stones as tools, may have been present in North America during the last interglacial period. The 2017 Nature paper described the site as having in situ hammerstones and stone anvils associated with fragmented remains of a single mastodon, with spiral fractured bones and molar fragments suggesting breakage while fresh, and uranium-thorium dating placing the burial at about 130.7 thousand years ago, plus or minus 9.4 thousand years. This was not a claim about a campfire, a village, a spear point, or a footprint. It was a claim about bone breakage, stone placement, impact marks, and geological context. In other words, it was exactly the kind of evidence that could become extremely important and extremely argued over at the same time. To understand why the bones mattered, it helps to think about how large animal bones break. Fresh bone does not behave like dry old bone. When bone is still fresh, it contains moisture and collagen, and it can break in spiral or curved patterns under force. Dry bone tends to fracture differently. Archaeologists and paleontologists study these patterns because they can help distinguish between breakage that occurred around the time of death and breakage that happened much later, after burial, weathering, or fossilization. The Cerutti team argued that some mastodon limb bones and molars were broken while fresh, and that the fracture patterns, impact scars, and association with large stones pointed toward deliberate percussion. In simpler terms, they proposed that someone, or some hominin group, used heavy cobbles to smash mastodon bones, perhaps to extract marrow or to produce bone fragments that could be used as raw material. The original paper also argued that the stones were unusual in the fine-grained sediment where they were found and showed impact wear, making them difficult to explain as ordinary natural rocks lying casually in the deposit. That is the argument in its strongest form. A mastodon carcass, or at least parts of one, lay at the site. Large stones were present in positions the researchers found meaningful. The bones were broken in ways they interpreted as fresh bone percussion. Some fragments could be refitted, suggesting breakage happened at the site rather than somewhere else. The stones had marks consistent in the team's view, with use as hammers and anvils. The geological context was argued to be intact. The bones were dated far beyond radiocarbon range, so the team used uranium-thorium methods, arriving at that startling age of about 130,000 years. Put all those details together, and the original authors concluded that hominin activity was the best explanation, not a casual possibility, not a vague maybe, a claim strong enough that they published it in Nature and understood very clearly that it would meet serious resistance, and it did. Almost immediately, many archaeologists and paleontologists were skeptical, not because they were unwilling to consider pre-Clovis sites, but because the Cerutti claim was so far outside the accepted pattern of evidence. By 2017, pre-Clovis occupation in the Americas was no longer outrageous in itself. Monteverde, Paisley Caves, and other sites had already helped open the door to earlier human presence. But 130,000 years is a very different matter. That is more than 100,000 years before Clovis. It is far older than White Sands. It is older than most widely discussed models of Homo sapiens' dispersal into northeastern Asia and the Americas. If true, it would not merely revise the peopling of North America. It would imply either a much earlier and currently almost invisible movement of humans, or human relatives into the continent, or some unknown population whose traces have almost completely vanished except for this one very controversial mastodon site. That is possible in the broadest logical sense, but science does not usually rebuild an entire continental history around one difficult site without asking many, many uncomfortable questions first. Some of the discomfort comes from what is missing. There were no human bones at the Cerutti Mastodon site. There were no flaked stone tools of the kind archaeologists are used to recognizing as clear human artifacts. There were no hearths, no cut-marked bones in a widely accepted butchery pattern, no camp debris, no repeated occupation layers, no footprints. The San Diego Natural History Museum itself notes that no human remains or flake stone tools were found, while also explaining that the original authors did not consider those absences fatal, because they interpreted the site as a bone processing location where simple cobble tools would have been enough. That's a reasonable point in one sense. Not every human activity leaves the same kind of evidence. People can use expedient tools and leave little behind. But the older and more surprising a claim becomes, the more those missing categories matter. If the date had been 13,000 years old, a bone processing site without formal tools might be easier to place within a broader known record. At 130,000 years old, the absence of other clear human evidence becomes much harder for many researchers to accept. Critics also focused on equifinality, a useful word that basically means different processes can produce similar results. A broken bone does not automatically identify the cause of breakage. Heavy sediment pressure, trampling by large animals, geological movement, construction disturbance, natural cobbles, water transport or other processes may leave damage that resembles intentional breakage, at least in some respects. The San Diego Natural History Museum's summary of the debate specifically notes that critics raised equifinality as a core issue. Showing that people could have produced broken bones and modified rocks is not the same as showing that only people could have produced them. That distinction is central. The Cerutti team did not need to show that humans can break bones with stones. Of course, humans can do that. The harder task was to show that the particular pattern at this particular site was best explained by hominin action, rather than by natural or modern disturbance. There were formal criticisms. Some researchers argued that geological or other non-human causes could better explain the site formation. A USGS summary of the Cerutti team's reply states that Brage and colleagues proposed the site features could be explained by geological or other causes unrelated to ancient human activity, while the Cerutti authors responded that this critique reflected an incomplete assessment of their evidence. Another critique, published in Antiquity, did not simply reject the possibility of early humans in the Americas in principle. Instead, it examined the experimental work used to support the Cerutti interpretation and argued that the experiments functioned more like pilot studies than a strong enough foundation to overturn decades of archaeological research. It called for more robust experimental design, better controls, larger sample sizes, and more quantitative results. That is a very archaeological kind of sentence. It may not sound dramatic, but it carries weight. It says, in effect, the claim is too important for evidence that is not yet strong enough. This is where the Cerutti Mastodon site becomes useful, even if one does not accept it as proven. It forces us to think about standards of evidence. What would it take to demonstrate a human or hominin presence in the Americas 130,000 years ago? A stone tool? Several stone tools? Cut marks? A hearth? DNA? A skeleton? Repeated sites? A pattern across a region? Science cannot demand impossible evidence, because the past does not always preserve what we would like, but it also cannot lower the standard so far that every unusual broken bone becomes a human story. Somewhere between those extremes is the difficult work of judgment. Cerutti sits right in that difficult space, not because the claim is obviously true, but because the evidence is not easily dismissed by everyone in the same way. Some researchers see percussion, intentional breakage, and anomalous stones. Others see a site where natural processes, disturbance, or insufficient experimental support remain more plausible. The bones have become uncomfortable because they are not silent enough to ignore and not clear enough to settle the matter. The dating itself is another interesting part of the story. The 130,000-year date comes from uranium-thorium analysis of mastodon bone, because radiocarbon dating cannot reach that far back reliably. The original Nature paper described multiple bone specimens dated with uranium series methods, producing an age of 130.7 thousand years with an uncertainty of 9.4 thousand years. Many critics have focused less on whether the bones are old and more on whether the old bones show human action. That is an important distinction. The site can be genuinely ancient without being archaeological. A mastodon can die, bones can break, stones can be present, and no humans need be involved. The question is not, are the bones old? So much as what happened to them and who or what caused it. Archaeology often depends on that difference. Age alone does not make a site human. Context and modification do. Imagine the scene as the Cerutti team interpreted it. A mastodon, already dead or perhaps recently dead, lies in a landscape near what is now San Diego. Hominins arrive. They do not necessarily make formal stone points or build a camp. They use heavy stones as simple tools, breaking limb bones and molars. Perhaps they are after marrow. Perhaps they want bone fragments. They strike, reposition, break, and leave. Sediment later covers the remains. Over 100,000 years pass. The site is buried, forgotten, then exposed during modern construction. It is a sparse scenario, but not an impossible behaviour. Humans and other members of the genus Homo have used stone tools for millions of years. Breaking bones with stones is well within the range of hominin ability. The trouble is not behavioural possibility. The trouble is biogeography. Who are these hominins? How did they get to North America? Where are their other sites? Why is there no broader trail? If a population reached California that early, did it survive? Did it vanish? Did it leave no descendants? Did it arrive by coast? Did it cross Beringia during an earlier warm interval? Each question opens another, and none can be answered from Cerutti alone. This is why many scientists remain unconvinced. One site, especially one without unmistakable artifacts or human remains, is a thin foundation for such a massive revision. The Cerutti authors themselves acknowledged the boldness of the claim and expected strong criticism. The San Diego Natural History Museum quoted lead author Steve Holen, saying that he had been a strong critic when he first examined the specimens and found the evidence shocking, while also saying the team wanted people to be critical. That attitude matters. It shows that the controversy is not simply believers versus skeptics in the casual sense. It is a dispute over how to interpret complex evidence. The original team believes the multiple lines of evidence point most reasonably to hominin activity. Many critics believe the evidence does not meet the necessary standard. The site remains in that unsettled zone where it is discussed, challenged, defended, and often treated as possible but unproven. For a sleep science journey, Cerutti might seem a little too argumentative. It does not have the gentle directness of White Sands footprints, or the careful accumulating strength of Paisley Caves. It has broken bones, disputed stones, missing tool types, and a date that makes everyone shift in their chair. But that is exactly why it belongs in this story. The peopling of the Americas is not only a story of accepted discoveries, it is also a story of how evidence is judged. Some sites become secure, some are rejected. Some remain open questions for years. Some provoke better methods, sharper experiments, and new searches in places that would once have been ignored. Even controversial claims can push a field forward by forcing researchers to explain what they will accept and why. Cerutti also warns us about two opposite mistakes. The first mistake is accepting a spectacular claim too quickly because it is exciting. There is no shortage of excitement in the idea of hominins in California 130,000 years ago. It would be a discovery with enormous implications. It would change migration models, human evolutionary history, and the search for early sites across North America. But excitement is not evidence. The past is not obliged to be exciting, though it often is. The second mistake is dismissing a claim too quickly, simply because it does not fit the current model. History has many examples of unpopular ideas becoming accepted after better evidence accumulates. Clovis-first itself lost authority because sites once treated skeptically eventually became harder to dismiss. So Cerutti asks for balance. Not belief, not ridicule, balance. A willingness to let the evidence be examined without forcing it into either a headline or a trash bin before the work is done. There is also the matter of scale. Paisley Caves, Rimrock Draw, and White Sands all challenge the old Clovis-first model, but they still fit within a late Pleistocene framework where modern humans were certainly capable of reaching the Americas. Cerutti reaches into the last interglacial period, long before the accepted cluster of early American evidence. The world then was different. Sea levels were higher than during the last glacial maximum. Bringia was not exposed in the same way it was during later glacial low stands. Human populations outside Africa were different too. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic human groups occupied parts of Eurasia. Homo sapiens existed, but the pattern of global dispersal was still unfolding. To place any Homo in California at that time would mean imagining a dispersal event that left almost no known trace across the enormous distances between Asia and North America. That does not make it impossible, but it makes it a very large claim leaning on a very small number of bones and stones. And yet the bones are real. The stones are real. The date is attached to the mastodon remains. The disagreement lies in the meaning. That is often the hardest kind of archaeological problem. If the evidence were fake, the matter would be simple. If it included a clearly made stone tool embedded under undisturbed 130,000-year-old sediment beside a human tooth, the matter would be less simple but far more persuasive. Instead, Cerutti sits in between. It is not enough for broad consensus, but not so empty that it has disappeared from discussion. It remains a kind of scientific irritant, and sometimes irritants are useful. A grain of sand in the shell does not always become a pearl, but it does get attention. One of the quieter lessons of the Cerutti Mastodon site is that the earliest human presence in any region may not look the way researchers expect. If a small group of hominins briefly reached North America and later died out, their archaeological signature might be faint. They might have used simple tools, occupied few sites, and left no genetic contribution to later populations. That is a hypothetical scenario, not a demonstrated one, but it is not absurd in principle. Human evolution includes many movements that did not lead directly to present-day populations. Some groups expanded and vanished, some interbred. Some left tools but no bones. Some left genes but few artifacts. The record is patchy everywhere, not just in the Americas. Still, a hypothetical possibility cannot stand in for evidence. It only reminds us that absence is complicated. No one has yet found the broader early record that Cerutti would require to feel secure. The site also reminds us that not all challenges to a timeline are equal. White Sands challenges Clovis-first with human footprints and multiple dating methods. Paisley challenges it with coprolites, DNA, lipids, artifacts, and stratigraphy. Rimrock Draw challenges it with tools, ash, extinct animal remains, and early dates that are still being refined. Cerutti challenges it with a much older and much more disputed interpretation of bone breakage and stone use. These should not be treated as if they all have the same strength. A good story can hold different levels of confidence at the same time. In fact, it must. Otherwise, the past becomes either too tidy or too gullible. The responsible position is to say that Cerutti is fascinating, highly controversial, not widely accepted as proof, and still important because it exposes the outer edge of the debate. Think of the mastodon itself. It was not a controversy in life. It was an animal moving through a Pleistocene landscape, heavy, powerful, and unaware that its bones would one day become part of a scientific argument about the earliest humans in North America. It died, and whatever happened afterward left its remains broken and buried. If hominins were involved, then the site preserves one of the most astonishing traces of early presence ever proposed in the Americas. If they were not, then the site preserves a complex natural or disturbed bone bed that has taught researchers a great deal about how careful they must be with extraordinary claims. Either way, the mastodon has become a participant in a debate it did not ask for. This is one of the occupational hazards of becoming a fossil. You may spend 130,000 years underground only to be accused of rewriting archaeology. The discomfort of Cerutti comes from the fact that it cannot be folded easily into the story we have been telling. It is too old to sit comfortably beside Paisley, Rimrock, or White Sands. It is too uncertain to serve as a new foundation. It is too interesting to ignore completely. So it remains there, like a heavy object at the edge of the room. The best way to handle it is not to exaggerate it, and not to erase it. We can say that researchers have proposed human or hominin activity at the site based on broken mastodon bones and associated stones dated to around 130,000 years ago. We can also say that many experts remain unconvinced because alternative explanations have not been ruled out to their satisfaction, because the experimental support has been criticised, and because the site lacks other clear signs of human presence. Both statements are true. The tension between them is the point. If future discoveries one day reveal other very old sites in North America with clearer artifacts, human remains, or repeated patterns of early occupation, Cerutti may be re-examined in a new light. It might become part of a sparse but real early record. Or future work may continue to weaken the case, leaving it as an instructive example of how natural processes can mimic human activity, and how careful scientists must be when evidence is ambiguous. At the moment, it is not the same kind of anchor as White Sands or Paisley. It is more like a question mark made of bone and stone. A large question mark, certainly, one with tusks nearby, but still a question mark, and that question mark matters because the broader story of human arrival in North America is no longer a narrow hallway. It is becoming a landscape of possibilities, some well supported, some provisional, some highly controversial. The old Clovis-first model has already been revised by stronger evidence. The accepted window for human presence has moved earlier. Coastal routes have gained importance. Interior sites have complicated the map. And at the farthest edge, Cerutti asks whether the field is prepared to look at evidence that seems almost too early to belong. Not to accept it automatically, but to ask what would count, what would not, and whether old landscapes may still be holding traces that current models have not trained us to see. From the broken mastodon bones of California, the story turns back toward movement, because whether Cerutti is ultimately accepted or not, the stronger early evidence from places like Paisley, Rimrock Draw, and White Sands still leaves a major problem to solve. If people were in western North America and the interior southwest before the old ice-free corridor explanation works neatly, then how did they get there? The answer may lie not only in land bridges and frozen corridors, but along shores now drowned beneath the Pacific, where kelp forests, shellfish beds, seabirds, fish, and small boats may have guided people south long before the map preserved their camps. For a long time, the first Americans were imagined as walkers. Not casual walkers, of course, not people strolling across a pleasant footpath with a packed lunch and sensible shoes. They were imagined as Ice Age travellers crossing Beringia from Northeast Asia into Alaska, then moving south through a narrow opening between the great ice sheets of Western Canada. In the older version of the story, this ice-free corridor was the essential doorway into the rest of North America. People waited in the north until the ice allowed passage, then followed animals into the continent, eventually leaving behind the Clovis points that seemed to mark their arrival. It was a land story, cold, difficult, impressive, but still a land story. The first Americans in that picture came on foot. But coastlines have a habit of changing the conversation. They are edges, and edges are often rich places. They are not quite land and not quite sea, but something busier, more generous, and more complicated. Tides bring food. Rivers meet salt water. Shellfish cling to rocks. Fish gather in kelp forests. Birds nest on cliffs and islands. Seals haul out along beaches. Driftwood arrives. Fresh water may be nearby. A person who knows how to live along a coast is not facing a blank boundary. They are facing a long, productive corridor where food appears in many forms and where travel by boat can sometimes be easier than travel over ice, mountains, dense forests, or unfamiliar interior country. This is where the coastal migration idea enters the story, and with it the wonderfully practical image known as the Kelp Highway. The Kelp Highway was never meant to suggest that ancient people paddled along a neatly marked marine road with signs saying, "Next shellfish bed, 3 miles," though one can admit that would have been very convenient. It is a hypothesis about ecology and movement. The basic idea is that kelp forest ecosystems along the North Pacific Rim may have provided a chain of similar productive coastal habitats that maritime peoples could follow from Northeast Asia toward Beringia, Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, California, and eventually farther south. John Erlandson and colleagues described the Kelp Highway hypothesis as the idea that kelp forest ecosystems may have helped facilitate the movement of maritime peoples from Asia to the Americas near the end of the Pleistocene. Kelp forests support fish, shellfish, marine mammals, seabirds, seaweeds, and other resources. They are not just underwater plants waving dramatically in the current like the ocean has decided to grow curtains. They are living systems dense with food and structure, and for coastal foragers they could have been reliable places to return to, learn from, and travel beside. This does not mean people ate only kelp, which is good news for anyone imagining the first Americans reluctantly chewing through miles of seaweed. The name points to the whole ecosystem. Kelp forests create habitat. They shelter fish. They attract animals. They occur along long stretches of cool coastal water. A migrating group would not need the coastline to be identical every mile. They would need enough repeated resources to make movement possible. Shellfish here, fish there, marine mammals in some places, seabirds, eggs, edible plants, freshwater streams, stone sources, wood, and safe landing places. Along coastlines, one useful place can lead to another. Knowledge can travel too. If a group knows how to harvest shellfish, fish near kelp beds, manage boats, read tides, and camp near water, then a new coastline may be unfamiliar but not incomprehensible. It is like entering a new kitchen, where the cupboards are in different places but food still works. The University of Oregon summarized the idea rather plainly when discussing research by archaeologist John Erlandson and colleagues. Kelp forests from Japan to Baja California could have supported migration by seafaring people along the coast before an inland ice-free corridor was available. That is the key point. The coastal route is not just an alternative route for the sake of having another arrow on the map. It helps solve a timing problem. If people were already south of the great ice sheets before the interior route was fully open and biologically useful, then they must have used some other path, or at least some additional path. The ice-free corridor may have mattered later. It may have been used by Clovis ancestors or other groups after it became viable. But if White Sands is truly showing human footprints in New Mexico between about 23,000 and 21,000 years ago, and if Oregon and Idaho sites show earlier than Clovis human presence in the West, then the old corridor-only explanation begins to look like a door that opens after some guests are already inside. The phrase biologically viable is important here. A corridor between ice sheets is not automatically a migration route just because ice has retreated enough to expose ground. People cannot live on exposed ground alone. They need plants, animals, fuel, water, and an ecosystem capable of supporting movement. A 2022 study on the ice-free corridor noted that ancient genomic and radiocarbon evidence indicate the corridor became suitable for human travel and subsistence only after earlier evidence already placed people south of the ice sheets, supporting attention to a Pacific coastal route. In other words, a route is not truly open when the ice says so. It is open when life says so. The difference is not trivial. A barren corridor could be crossed perhaps by a desperate group under special conditions, but it is unlikely to be the main pathway for families, children, elders, tools, dogs if present, food supplies, and the slow practical business of living through an ice age landscape. Technically walkable and good place to move an entire people are not the same thing, as anyone who has ever tried to carry groceries across an icy parking lot will understand on a very small scale. The coast offers a different kind of possibility. During the last glacial maximum, sea levels were much lower than today because so much water was locked in ice sheets. The shoreline that early people may have followed was often far west of the modern shore. Many of the beaches, estuaries, islands, river mouths, and campsites that could have been used are now underwater. This is both one of the strongest reasons the coastal route is plausible, and one of the reasons it is so difficult to prove. The evidence may be gone, buried offshore, eroded by waves, or hidden under marine sediment. Archaeologists are trying to reconstruct a journey whose most important campsites may now be beneath meters of water. It is a little like trying to solve a family mystery after someone has carefully stored the family album at the bottom of the sea. This drowned coastline problem helps explain why the absence of many very early coastal sites does not necessarily defeat the coastal migration hypothesis. For a long time, critics could point out that the earliest sites were mostly inland, or at least not preserved along the specific ancient coasts one might expect if people travelled by sea. That is a fair concern. Archaeology needs sites. It cannot run forever on attractive possibilities in marine scenery. But if the late Pleistocene shorelines are now submerged, then the most direct evidence is exactly the evidence least likely to have been found by traditional land-based archaeology. Researchers have to look offshore, on islands, in submerged landscapes, and in places where ancient coastlines were uplifted or otherwise preserved above modern sea level. That work is difficult, expensive, and often slow. The ocean does not hand over artifacts as politely as a dry cave sometimes does. It prefers paperwork, boats, sonar, divers, sediment cores, and patience. The kelp highway idea also changes the image of ancient technology. If early people moved along the Pacific coast, then boats or other watercraft were likely involved. This does not require enormous ships or anything like later sailing vessels. Small boats, skin boats, dugouts, rafts, or other craft could have served for moving along protected shorelines, crossing short stretches of water, reaching islands and harvesting marine resources. Unfortunately, boats are usually made from perishable materials. Wood, hide, fibre and cordage rarely survive tens of thousands of years, especially in dynamic coastal environments. So the absence of a 20,000-year-old boat in a museum case is not very surprising. If someone loses a stone point, archaeology smiles. If someone loses a wooden paddle on a changing shore, time often eats it without leaving a receipt. This creates a bias in the record. Stone-heavy inland activities are easier to see than fibre and wood-heavy coastal activities. A group that relied on nets, baskets, lines, traps, boats, wooden tools and shellfish gathering might leave a very different archaeological signature from a group making large distinctive stone projectile points on open plains. Shell middens can preserve well, but many early ones may be underwater. Bone tools may decay unless conditions are favourable. Fishhooks, cordage, basketry and boat parts are unlikely to survive except in rare preservation settings. The result is that a maritime people can be archaeologically faint, not because they were unskilled or unimportant, but because their most important tools did not want to become fossils. Wood, in particular, has a terrible attitude about long-term preservation. Still, there are hints that Pleistocene humans were capable of maritime movement long before the peopling of the Americas. Humans reached Sahul, the combined Ice Age landmass of Australia and New Guinea, by at least tens of thousands of years ago, and that required crossing water. People in island Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific were clearly able to navigate marine environments in deep time, so the idea that late Pleistocene peoples along the North Pacific could have used boats is not an extravagant fantasy. It is consistent with broader human adaptability. Humans are not only walkers, we are shoreline watchers, tide readers, fish catchers, raft makers, and occasional overpackers of supplies. The coastal migration hypothesis does not require a sudden invention of seafaring at the edge of America. It asks whether people already comfortable with coasts could have followed productive marine habitats into new territory. The North Pacific Rim would have offered repeated ecological opportunities. From parts of Japan and the Kuril Islands to Kamchatka, the Aleutians, coastal Alaska, British Columbia, the Pacific Northwest, California and beyond, cool water coastal environments could support kelp forests and associated food webs. Erlandson and colleagues argued that the linear distribution of similar coastal habitats and resources may have provided an ecologically familiar corridor for expanding maritime peoples, with Pacific Rim kelp forests offering productive and predictable marine resources. That word familiar matters. Migration into new lands is not only about distance, it is about how strange the next place is. A coastal traveller moving from one kelp-rich shoreline to another might find many differences, but also a pattern. Rocks, tides, shellfish, fish, birds, mammals, beaches, freshwater streams, driftwood. Enough repetition to make learning possible. Enough food to make movement less desperate. Enough similarity to make the journey less like entering another planet and more like moving through variations of a known world. This is where the term highway can be a little misleading if we take it too literally. A highway suggests speed and direction. But ancient movement was probably not a single rapid trip from Asia to South America, with everyone neatly staying in their lane. It may have been slow, generational, uneven, and full of pauses. Some groups may have moved only a short distance in a lifetime. Others may have expanded quickly when resources, population pressure, curiosity, conflict, climate, or opportunity pushed them onward. Coastal travel could allow faster movement than inland travel in some conditions, especially if boats were used. But that does not mean people experienced it as a mission to reach the end of the continent. They were not trying to prove a theory. They were living along coasts and over many generations. Living along coasts can become migration. A coastal route also helps explain one of the most puzzling things about early sites in the Americas. They're spread across large distances. If people were at White Sands more than 20,000 years ago, then the timing of entry must be older. If sites in the Pacific Northwest and Interior West are older than Clovis, and South American sites such as Monteverde have long been central to the pre-Clovis discussion, then people may have dispersed through the hemisphere earlier and perhaps faster than a simple inland route once suggested. The coastal route offers a way to move along a long north-south edge with rich resources. It could have served as the first corridor into the Americas, with later movement inland along rivers, passes, lake basins and ecological zones. A shoreline can be a route, but river mouths are invitations. Follow the coast long enough, and you find pathways into the continent. Oregon sits in an important position in this picture. It is not just where some interesting pre-Clovis evidence happens to appear. It lies near a region where coastal and interior routes could have interacted. The Pacific coast is west of the Cascades. The Great Basin lies to the east. Rivers, mountain passes, and changing habitats connect these worlds in complex ways. Paisley Caves and Rimrock Draw are inland, but they may still belong to a broader story of people moving through western landscapes after, or while, some groups used coastal routes. The evidence does not require us to imagine a person paddling directly to Paisley Caves, which would be difficult and damp for all the wrong reasons. It invites us to consider how coastal movement and inland expansion could be linked. People travelling along the coast could move inland through river valleys. Inland groups could move between basins, wetlands, and uplands. Technologies and knowledge could spread through contact. A single route may never have been the whole story. The coastal idea also broadens what arrival means. If people moved along shorelines, they might have reached some parts of the Americas very early, while other regions remained unoccupied or only lightly used. Inland settlement could lag behind coastal movement. Populations could expand, retreat, or disappear locally. The first evidence in a region might not represent the first entry into the hemisphere, but the first preserved trace of people moving inland. This is important for places like Oregon and New Mexico. A footprint in New Mexico at 23,000 years ago does not tell us where the first landing occurred. A tool in Oregon does not by itself identify the migration route, but together, such evidence makes the continent's human story older and more geographically complex. The earliest people may have moved through a mosaic of coastlines, river systems, deserts, wetlands, and open plains, rather than down one tidy corridor like beads sliding along a string. There is another reason the Kelp Highway has gained attention. It fits human behaviour. People tend to move through landscapes that make sense to them. A skilled coastal group would know how to use marine resources that are often predictable and abundant. Shellfish, for instance, do not run away, which is very considerate of them. Fish may be seasonal, but they can gather in large numbers. Marine mammals can be dangerous and difficult, but also valuable. Seaweeds, birds, eggs, driftwood, and intertidal resources create a broad food base. This kind of economy can support mobility without relying on one large animal species or one risky hunting strategy. Of course, coastlines can also be dangerous. Storms, cold water, tides, fog, rocky shores, and sudden weather are serious hazards. But ancient people were not helpless wanderers. They were skilled observers. The same coastal knowledge that makes a shoreline dangerous to outsiders can make it useful to people who understand it. The hypothesis is still being tested. Researchers look for early sites on uplifted terraces, islands, submerged landscapes, and coastal caves. They study ancient sea level changes to reconstruct where shorelines were. They analyse genetic evidence, stone tool traditions, paleo environments, marine ecology, and the timing of ice retreat. A 2020 formulation of coastal migration theory argued that Pleistocene humans were south of the North American ice sheets, before about 15,000 years ago, predating the full opening of the ice-free corridor, and identified migration along the Pacific coast as the most likely initial route of entry, while also noting that the exact timing and route of gene flow remain unresolved. That last part is important. The coastal route is not a finished map. It is a working explanation supported by timing, ecology, and the limitations of the interior corridor, but still hungry for more direct evidence. Science, like a coastal forager, does best when it keeps looking in the right places. The idea has also expanded beyond North America. Recent research has continued exploring how kelp-dominated seascapes may have shaped coastal dispersal farther south along the Pacific Rim, including South America, where kelp ecosystems and marine productivity could also have mattered for early peoples. That does not mean every early community along the Pacific coast lived the same way, or followed kelp like a trail of breadcrumbs. Environments vary, cultures vary, people adapt locally. But the broader point remains. The Pacific coast was not a barrier. It could have been a corridor. For people with watercraft and coastal knowledge, the ocean was not simply the edge of the world. It was part of the world. This is a useful shift in imagination. Modern maps show land in solid colours and ocean in blue, which can make the sea look like empty space between important things. But for maritime peoples, the sea is not empty. It has paths, seasons, landmarks, hazards, and resources. A coastline is not the end of the land. It is a long living edge. When we imagine the first Americans as only inland walkers, we may be projecting our own map habits onto people who understood the world differently. They may have moved by canoe or raft along protected waters, crossed short distances between islands, camped near estuaries, collected shellfish, fished kelp forests, and gradually expanded into new territory. Their maps, if they held them in memory, may have been made of headlands, currents, bird colonies, fresh water sources, reefs, beaches, and stories about where not to land when the weather turns rude. This does not erase Beringia. In fact, it makes Beringia larger in meaning. Beringia was not just a land bridge to be crossed once. It was a broad region where people may have lived for thousands of years, adapting to cold environments and moving when conditions allowed. Some groups may have moved inland, some may have moved along the coast, some may have done both at different times. Later inland movement through an ice-free corridor may still have contributed to the spread of people and technology such as Clovis. Recent finds in Alaska continue to support the importance of interior northern routes for some later populations, including possible ancestors of Clovis groups. The old mistake was not in thinking land routes mattered. The mistake was in thinking one land route explained everything. A more realistic picture might include several movements. Some early people may have travelled along the Pacific coast before the interior corridor was viable. Some groups may have moved inland from the coast into western basins and river systems. Others may have moved through interior Alaska and later through the corridor when it became ecologically open. Populations may have split, merged, vanished, or changed technologies. The first human presence in the Americas may not have been a single arrival, but a long process with multiple pulses. The Kelp Highway is one of the routes that makes this complexity possible. It offers a way to understand how people could be far south early, how coastal and inland evidence might connect, and why so much of the earliest record is difficult to find. There is something quietly practical about this idea, and that practicality makes it powerful. It does not require people to charge through impossible ice. It does not require the first Americans to wait politely at a frozen gate until a corridor became suitable. It asks us to look at the Pacific coast as a real habitat, rich in food and travel possibilities. It asks us to remember that boats can be older than their surviving remains. It asks us to take seriously the knowledge of people who lived with tides, fish, birds, storms and shorelines. And it asks archaeology to search in places that are inconvenient, wet, submerged and expensive, which is a rather typical request from deep history. If we return for a moment to Oregon, the coastal story gives the state's early evidence a wider frame. Paisley Caves and Rimrock Draw are not isolated oddities sitting awkwardly east of the Cascades. They may be inland traces of a broader western movement, evidence that people were using the Great Basin, while the old Clovis-first timeline still expected the continent's human story to be younger. The route into that world may have involved the Pacific shore, and perhaps rivers and basins leading inland. Or it may have involved routes we have not fully reconstructed yet. The important thing is that Oregon no longer appears as a late stop after the first Americans marched through a single interior corridor. It becomes part of a much older western landscape of possibility. Picture then not one grand migration, but a coastline alive with small decisions. A group pulls a boat above the tide line. Someone checks a net or trap. Someone gathers shellfish from rocks, careful of slippery footing because ancient dignity was probably no safer from falling over than modern dignity. Children watch adults work. Elders remember a better landing farther south. Smoke rises near a freshwater stream. Offshore, kelp beds move with the swell. Beyond the headland is another bay, another beach, another set of animals, another place to learn. No one calls it a highway. No one needs a name for it. It is simply the way the world continues. And then the sea rises, slowly by human standards, quickly by geological ones. Camps near old shorelines disappear beneath water. Beaches move inland. Estuaries change. The route itself is partly hidden. Later archaeologists stand on the modern coast and wonder where the evidence has gone, while much of it rests offshore under sediment and wave noise, as if the Pacific has folded the first pages of the story beneath its surface. The inland traces remain more visible. A cave in Oregon, a rock shelter, footprints in New Mexico, tools in old layers. They are not the whole story, but they are the places where the hidden coastline reaches back into view. The Kelp Highway does not close the mystery. It opens it in a more useful direction. It tells us that the first Americans may have been seafarers as well as walkers, coastal foragers as well as inland hunters, people whose lives move between land and water with a skill that rarely preserves well in stone. It allows the Oregon discoveries, the White Sands footprints, and other early sites to sit within a broader explanation that does not depend on a single late opening corridor. And it reminds us that some of the most important routes in human history may now be underwater, not lost exactly, but quiet, waiting for methods patient enough to follow them. From here the story widens again, because once the coast becomes possible, and the interior no longer holds the only path, the peopling of the Americas begins to look less like one migration and more like many journeys, some preserved, some drowned, some still buried beneath the changing face of the continent. Once the coastline comes back into the story, the whole map begins to loosen. The old version of the first American journey had a clean shape. People crossed Beringia, waited for the ice to open, walked down through the corridor and spread across the continent with Clovis tools. But after Paisley Caves, Rimrock Draw, White Sands, and the wider collection of pre-Clovis sites, that shape no longer holds as firmly. It is not that Beringia disappears. It is not that walking becomes unimportant. It is not that Clovis suddenly stops mattering. It is that the story becomes less like a single road and more like a landscape full of possible paths, some visible, some hidden, some drowned, and some still waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. This is one of the hardest adjustments when thinking about the peopling of the Americas. We want the first arrival to be a moment, a single crossing, a first camp, a first family looking south, a first fire beneath a cold sky. But migration rarely behaves that neatly. Human movement is usually a process, not an event. It happens in pulses, pauses, experiments, returns, failures, expansions, and small decisions made by people who are not thinking about the historical significance of what they're doing. They are thinking about weather, food, children, illness, tools, water, shelter, and whether the next valley or beach might be safer than the last one. A migration that looks like one line from a distance may have been hundreds or thousands of local choices when lived up close. From far above, it is an arrow. On the ground, it is sore feet, smoke, hunger, memory, and someone asking whether anyone remembered to bring the good scraper. The current evidence does not demand one simple pathway. A major review of archaeological and genetic evidence concluded that the data allow for inland routes, coastal routes, or multiple pathways into North America, rather than forcing a single explanation. That may sound cautious, but it is a significant change from the old Clovis-first confidence. It means the discussion has moved from the first people came this way to the first people may have come in more than one way, at more than one time, using routes that changed as the climate changed. This is not a weaker story. It is a more realistic one. Human beings are adaptable. We do not generally see one possible route across a continent and politely ignore all others. If there is a coast, someone may follow it. If there is a river, someone may move along it. If there is a pass, someone may test it. If there is a shoreline full of shellfish and fish, someone will probably figure out that dinner has been waiting there with remarkable patience. The idea of multiple journeys also makes sense because the Americas are enormous. North America alone contains coasts, mountains, deserts, forests, plains, wetlands, ice margins, river valleys, and high plateaus. South America adds rainforests, Andean corridors, Pacific shorelines, Atlantic coasts, grasslands, and cold southern landscapes. It is unlikely that one mode of life, one tool tradition, and one route explain the first human expansion through all of that. Some groups may have moved along the Pacific coast, others may have moved inland later, some may have followed rivers from coast to interior. Some may have used open corridors once they became productive. Some early movements may have left no descendants, or no clear archaeological trace. Some later populations may have carried forward genetic lineages while changing technologies completely. The past is not obliged to keep artifacts, genes, languages, and roots lined up for our convenience. It very often refuses, perhaps out of principle. Genetic evidence adds another layer to this picture. Broadly, indigenous peoples of the Americas share deep ancestry with populations of Northeast Asia, supporting the importance of Beringia in the early history of American peoples. A 2020 review of coastal migration theory described the genetic evidence for indigenous American ancestry in Northeast Asia as overwhelming, while also arguing that archaeological evidence south of the ice sheets before the opening of the ice-free corridor points logically toward an initial coastal route before about 16,000 years ago. That is a careful but important combination. Beringia remains central. The question is what happened after or during the time people were in and around that northern region. Did some groups move south along the coast before inland routes were ready? Did others remain in Beringia for long periods? Did later groups move inland through the corridor after it became livable? The answer may not be either coast or corridor. It may be both, but not at the same time and not for everyone. There is also the Beringian standstill idea, which suggests that ancestral Native American populations may have spent a long period isolated in or around Beringia before dispersing into the rest of the Americas. This model is based largely on genetic evidence, and researchers have discussed it as part of a broader three-stage dispersal process from Siberia to Beringia, and then into the Americas. The image is less dramatic than a sudden crossing, but perhaps more human. People living for generations in a northern landscape, adapting to its cold conditions, knowing its animals and plants, raising children who grow up with no memory of anywhere else. Then, as environments shift, ice retreats in some regions, coasts open, sea levels change, and resources move, some descendants begin to spread. Not a single expedition, but a long unfolding. It is slower, stranger, and more believable than a single grand entrance. The ice sheets themselves were not static walls. They advanced, retreated, merged, separated, and reshaped entire regions. The Cordilleran ice sheet lay to the west, the Laurentide to the east, and between them the famous ice-free corridor eventually opened. But a passage is not the same thing as a practical migration route. Researchers studying ice and ocean constraints have noted that growing evidence for human presence in the Americas before 15,000 years ago creates problems for a corridor-first explanation, because ice sheets blocked transit through the continental interior during earlier periods. Even when ice withdrew enough to expose land, plants and animals had to return before people could rely on the corridor for subsistence. A newly opened landscape can be technically passable, but still not especially hospitable. It is the difference between a restaurant being unlocked and a restaurant having food. Both are useful details, but one matters more if you're hungry. The coast, meanwhile, may have offered another kind of route. Not necessarily an easy one, because cold Pacific shorelines are not gentle places, and the ocean has never been famous for caring about human plans. But for people with coastal knowledge and watercraft, the Pacific edge could have been productive and familiar. Shellfish, fish, marine mammals, seabirds, seaweeds, freshwater streams, driftwood and kelp forest ecosystems may have provided repeated resources from one coastline to the next. The difficulty for archaeology is that the coast those people may have used is often no longer where the coast is today. After the last glacial maximum, rising seas submerged vast stretches of paleo shoreline, including many of the places early coastal peoples might have lived, camped, and moved through. Researchers have emphasized that post-glacial sea level rise submerged nearly all Pacific Coast paleo shorelines that would have been available to early coastal peoples. That is an enormous problem. It means the absence of many early coastal sites may be partly a preservation problem, not necessarily a migration problem. Imagine trying to reconstruct a road system after someone has flooded the roads, buried the signs, moved the towns, and left only a few hilltop rest stops above water. That is the situation with parts of the early Pacific coastal route. Archaeologists are not simply looking for camps in the wrong places because they are careless. They are looking on a modern landscape that does not match the Ice Age one. The shoreline was farther out. River mouths were in different positions. Islands may have been larger or connected. Estuaries shifted. Beaches that once held footprints, fires, tools, bones, and shell middens may now be under waves. The evidence is not necessarily gone, but it may be hidden beneath marine sediment, difficult to detect or already eroded. The ocean is an excellent archivist in some circumstances, and a terrible one in others. It preserves shipwrecks, buries landscapes, grinds coastlines, and generally behaves like a librarian who sometimes eats the pages. This is why underwater and nearshore archaeology has become so important. Researchers now use sea level models, sonar, sediment cores, ancient shoreline reconstruction, and predictive mapping to identify places where submerged coastal sites might survive. Work on California's Northern Channel Islands, for example, has used the locations of known paleocoastal archaeological sites above water to model high-probability submerged landforms that might contain evidence of early coastal peoples. This is slow, difficult work, and it does not always produce quick rewards. It asks archaeologists to think like geologists, oceanographers, and detectives at the same time, which seems a little unfair but is apparently necessary. Instead of walking a dry field and spotting a stoneflake, they may need boats, remote sensing equipment, cores of underwater sediment, and a strong tolerance for ambiguity. Deep history rarely provides convenient parking. The lost coastline problem also helps explain why inland evidence can become so important for a coastal hypothesis. At first that sounds backwards. If people came along the coast, why are we talking about caves in Oregon, tools in Idaho, or footprints in New Mexico? But coastal movement and inland occupation are not separate worlds. A group travelling along a shore could move inland through river valleys. Inland basins with wetlands, lakes, and animals could attract people from coastal regions. Over generations, communities could spread through ecological corridors that connected shorelines to interior landscapes. So inland sites may preserve later echoes of a route whose earliest coastal traces are now submerged. Paisley Caves and Rimrock Draw may not prove a coastal route on their own, but they show that early people were present in the western interior before the old model expected. White Sands shows people far to the south during the last glacial maximum. Cooper's Ferry in Idaho adds another important western pre-Clovis site, with reports of human presence in the Columbia River Basin around 16,000 years ago, and tool evidence that has been discussed in relation to early Pacific connections. Each site is local. Together they create a wider pattern. Patterns are important, but they must be handled carefully. It is tempting to gather every old site and declare them all part of one grand coastal migration. That would be too easy. The people at Paisley were not necessarily the same cultural group as the people at White Sands. Rimrock Draw, if its earliest evidence continues to hold, may represent a different activity, a different time, and a different community. Cooper's Ferry has its own technological and environmental context. Monteverde in Chile, another famous pre-Clovis site, adds a far southern data point that has long forced archaeologists to think beyond Clovis. These places do not need to be identical to matter. Their importance is that they break the older expectation from different directions. Some are caves, some are rock shelters, some are open-air sites, some preserve footprints, some preserve tools, some preserve organic remains. The old story relied heavily on one visible culture appearing around one time. The new story is built from different kinds of evidence appearing in different landscapes, and that makes it messier but harder to dismiss. This is where the timeline begins to come undone, not in the sense of falling apart completely, but in the sense of losing its old straight seam. Clovis no longer marks the beginning. Instead, Clovis becomes one important development within a longer and more varied human presence. The first people in the Americas may have arrived before the archaeological record becomes easy to see. Their earliest camps may be underwater, their tools may have been made from wood, bone, fibre, or simple stone cobbles that are difficult to recognise. Their populations may have been small, their sites may be deeply buried, eroded, or misidentified. The earliest chapters of the human story in the Americas may be less visible not because they were less real, but because they were less convenient for archaeology. And this, in a way, is the great humbling lesson. Archaeology does not uncover the past evenly. It finds what preservation, research history, funding, geography, and luck allow it to find. Clovis points were found early and widely because they are distinctive stone artifacts that preserve well. They became the anchor because they were visible, but visibility can be mistaken for priority. If a person shouts in a quiet room, you hear them first. That does not mean they were the first person in the building, Clovis shouted in stone. Earlier peoples may have whispered in fibre, wood, footprints, shell, charcoal, and traces now beneath the sea. The idea of multiple journeys also softens some of the tension between competing models. The inland corridor may still have been important, especially after it became ecologically viable. A later movement through the corridor could have contributed to the spread of certain technologies, populations, or cultural practices. The coastal route may have been earlier, or used by some groups and not others. Beringia may have been both a homeland and a passageway. Interior Alaska may have held populations whose descendants moved at different times. There may have been coastal dispersals, inland dispersals, pauses, returns, and regional expansions. The question is not simply, which route did the first Americans take, but which people, at which time, using which routes, under which environmental conditions. That is a longer question, and perhaps less satisfying on a flashcard, but it is closer to how human history works. The genetic picture also supports complexity, though it does not give archaeologists a perfect map. Genetic lineages can tell us about ancestry, population splits, bottlenecks, and relationships among groups, but genes do not preserve campsites, toolkits, or exact footpaths. A population can move without leaving many artifacts. A technology can spread without a large movement of people. A group can contribute ancestry and later change its way of life completely. Genetic evidence and archaeological evidence are like two witnesses describing the same old journey from different windows. One can see family relationships through time, the other can see tools, food, places, and activities. They do not always speak in the same language, and sometimes they appear to disagree, when really they are answering different questions. Lost coastlines make this even harder. If early coastal peoples moved quickly along the Pacific Rim, leaving small camps at now submerged shorelines, the genetic signal of their descendants might be visible while the archaeological route is nearly invisible. Or the opposite might happen. A site may preserve activity from a group that left little or no genetic trace in later populations. Some early movements could have failed, with communities disappearing due to climate stress, small population size, isolation, conflict, disease, or simple bad luck. The peopling of a hemisphere was not guaranteed to succeed at every step. We see the surviving lineages and the surviving evidence, but survival itself is a filter. The past we can study is the past that made it through. There is also the matter of cultural change. The earliest people entering the Americas did not remain frozen in one way of life. Over thousands of years, populations adapted to new environments, invented new tools, changed old technologies, developed regional traditions and learned local ecologies. A coastal group moving inland might stop being primarily coastal after a few generations. An inland group might adopt new tools after contact with others. A projectile point style can emerge, spread, and disappear. Food systems can shift as climates change and animals vanish. So we should not expect one migration route to produce one permanent archaeological signature. Human cultures are not museum labels in motion. They change because people change, landscapes change, and children rarely do everything exactly the way their grandparents did, a fact that has probably been causing mild concern since the Pleistocene. The end of the Ice Age brought enormous environmental change. Ice sheets melted, sea levels rose, lakes expanded or dried, vegetation zones shifted, megafauna declined and disappeared. Rivers changed course, coastlines moved inland. These changes did not happen all at once, and they did not affect every region in the same way, but they reshaped the world early Americans lived in. A route that was useful in one century might be gone in another. A campsite near a productive shore might become submerged. A wet basin might become desert. A pass might open. A lake might shrink. Animals might move elsewhere. People had to respond to these changes in real time, not as a neat transition from Ice Age to after Ice Age, but as weather, hunger, opportunity, and risk. Archaeological timelines can make change look orderly. Living through it was probably much more like trying to organise a household while someone keeps moving the walls. The older Clovis-first model had the advantage of being easy to tell. There is no denying that. A single story fits well in a textbook paragraph. It gives students a date, a route, a culture, and a tool type. But the evidence now points toward a longer, more layered story. It asks for a timeline with gaps and overlaps. It asks for routes that include water as well as land. It asks us to look beneath modern shorelines and beyond the most obvious stone tools. It asks us to accept that some early sites will be strong, others provisional, and a few controversial enough to keep everyone awake at conferences. This is not a failure of the story. It is the story becoming more honest. And perhaps that honesty makes the early Americans more human, not less. A single migration wave can feel almost mechanical. People move from A to B because the map says so. Multiple journeys feel lived. Some follow a coast, some follow animals. Some stay in a region for generations. Some move inland. Some return north. Some cross water. Some avoid it. Some learn wetlands. Others mountains, others shorelines, others deserts. People carry children, tools, memories, injuries, beliefs, and habits. They bury their dead. They laugh, they argue, they teach, they make mistakes, they leave things behind. Most of those things vanish. A few remain, and we build our timelines around them as carefully as we can. So when the Oregon discoveries do not fit the old human timeline, it is not because the Earth has made an error, it is because the timeline was too narrow. Paisley Caves, Rimrock Draw, White Sands, and even the uncomfortable question mark of Cerutti all remind us that human presence in the Americas cannot be reduced to one point of entry and one founding culture. Some evidence is secure, some is still debated, some is far outside the consensus, but taken together, the discoveries show a field in motion. Clovis has moved from first page to important later page. The ice-free corridor has moved from sole doorway to one possible route among others. The Pacific coast has moved from edge of the map to a serious candidate for early movement. And the timeline itself has stretched backward into older, more complicated terrain. The image that remains is not one arrow crossing a land bridge, but many faint tracks across changing ground. Some tracks run along vanished beaches now covered by the Pacific. Some turn inland through river valleys and basins. Some pass caves in Oregon. Some cross wet mud in New Mexico. Some may lie beneath cities, farms, forests, deserts, or the continental shelf. Some have been erased entirely. The task now is not to force them into one line, but to follow them with patience. Because the first human history of the Americas was not written for us in a clean sequence. It was scattered through landscapes, hidden in sediments, drowned by rising seas and preserved in fragments. And as those fragments continue to emerge, the old timeline does not simply break. It opens, leaving room for a longer and more complicated human journey than anyone once expected, and for the quiet, final question of what the Earth remembers when history forgets. What the Earth remembers is not always what people write down. In fact, for most of human history there was nothing written down at all. No journals, no maps, no names carved into stone, no dates carefully marked in a calendar. There were only lives being lived, and then the physical traces those lives happened to leave behind. A footprint in wet mud, a tool dropped near a shelter, a scrap of fibre, a broken animal bone, a hearth stain, a trace of ancient food passing through the body and ending up, rather undignified but scientifically useful, in a dry cave. These are not the kind of things people usually choose as monuments, but deep time has strange taste. It rarely preserves what seems grand in the moment. It preserves what conditions allow. A palace can crumble, a song can vanish, a shoreline can drown, but a footprint under the right layer of mud can wait for more than 20,000 years, saying nothing until someone finally notices, and that may be the most important idea in this whole journey. The earliest human story in North America was never missing because people were not there. It was missing in part because the evidence was hard to see. Some of it was buried. Some of it was dismissed because it did not match what researchers expected. Some of it was made from materials that decayed long before archaeology had a chance to ask any questions. Some of it may now lie beneath the Pacific, under water that rose after the Ice Age and covered old beaches, old campsites, old estuaries, and perhaps the resting places of people who knew the coastline in ways we can barely reconstruct. If early travellers moved by sea along kelp forests and sheltered shorelines, then many of their most important traces may be underwater now, which is a rather effective way for history to become inconvenient. For many decades, the Clovis-first model gave North America a clear beginning. People crossed from Asia into Alaska, moved through an ice-free corridor, and spread across the continent with fluted stone points. It was not a foolish story. It was built on real evidence. Clovis tools are remarkable, widespread, and clearly human. They tell us about skill, mobility, hunting, teaching, and survival in a changing Ice Age world. The people who made them were not minor figures simply because they are no longer considered the first. They were part of a major and impressive human tradition. But the mistake was turning a strong visible signal into the whole beginning. Clovis was bright in the archaeological record, and because it was bright, it looked like sunrise. Now it looks more like daylight already falling across a landscape where people had been moving for some time. Paisley Caves helped change that. In the dry country of Oregon, evidence from ancient coprolites, tools, fibres, dating, and chemical traces showed that people were present before Clovis, in a way that could no longer be brushed aside as easily as older claims had been. It was not glamorous evidence, at least not in the usual sense. No one makes a dramatic movie poster out of preserved feces from a cave, though one should never underestimate the creativity of documentary producers. But it mattered because it was direct, testable, and tied to a real place. It showed that people had lived in the northern Great Basin earlier than the old model expected, using technologies and resources that did not fit neatly into a Clovis-only picture. Rimrock Draw then made the Oregon story feel even deeper. A rock shelter, a tool, volcanic ash, extinct animal remains, and early dates suggested that humans may have been present in Oregon more than 18,000 years ago. That claim still requires care, and it should. Science is strongest when it does not confuse possibility with certainty. But even as a careful, developing case, Rimrock Draw matters. It reminds us that the human past in the West may be older and more varied than the old model allowed. It shows how a scraper or a flake in the right layer can become a serious question. Not a loud question, not a final answer, but the kind of question that makes archaeologists return to the ground with better tools, better methods, and a little more humility. Then White Sands gave the story something no theory could make feel distant. Footprints. Human footprints across ancient mud in what is now New Mexico. Adults, children, younger people, moving through a wet Ice Age landscape where mammoths and giant ground sloths also passed. The dating of those footprints has been debated and tested, because a claim of humans in North America more than 20,000 years ago has to be tested carefully. But multiple dating methods have strengthened the case that the tracks belong to a time far earlier than Clovis, and footprints do something that stone tools sometimes cannot. They remove some of the emotional distance. A tool tells us that someone made or used an object. A footprint tells us that someone placed their body there, balanced there, shifted weight there, lifted their foot and kept going. It is a brief action, almost nothing in the moment, yet under the right conditions it can outlast cities. And then there is the Cerutti Mastodon site sitting uncomfortably at the edge of the discussion. It is different from the others. It is far older, far more controversial, and not accepted in the same way. Broken mastodon bones and large stones in California have been interpreted by some researchers as evidence of hominin activity around 130,000 years ago, but many experts remain unconvinced. The site lacks clear stone tools, human remains, or the kind of repeated evidence that would make such a staggering claim easier to accept. It may one day look different if future discoveries provide a broader pattern, or it may remain an instructive case of how difficult it is to separate human action from natural processes when the evidence is ambiguous. Either way, Cerutti matters because it shows the outer edge of the debate. It reminds us that not every challenge to the timeline is equally strong, and that responsible curiosity must travel with caution, especially when the bones are asking us to move history back by more than 100,000 years. Taken together, these places do not create one simple replacement for Clovis-first. That is important. The answer is not that the old single story was wrong and now we have a new single story polished and ready for a museum wall. The better answer is that the earliest human history of the Americas was probably more complex than one route, one date, and one tool tradition. People may have moved in more than one wave. Some may have travelled along the Pacific coast by boat, making use of kelp forests, shellfish, fish, marine mammals, birds and freshwater streams. Others may have moved through interior routes later, when ice-free corridors became biologically useful. Some groups may have entered, spread, and disappeared. Some may have left descendants. Some may have left only faint traces. Some may have left traces that are now underwater or buried too deeply to find. A human timeline is not a straight hallway. It is more like a landscape crossed by paths at different times, with some paths preserved and others erased by weather, water, and chance. This makes the search harder, but it also makes the people more real. The first Americans were not an arrow moving across a map. They were families, groups, communities, and generations. They were people who knew hunger and weather, people who learned stone, bone, wood, plants, animals, tides, rivers and seasons. People who carried children, repaired tools, remembered safe places, avoided dangerous ones, and watched the world change around them. They did not know they were early. They did not know a future argument called Clovis-first would one day make their presence controversial. They were not trying to become evidence. They were trying to live. That is one of the strange things about archaeology. It turns accidents into testimony. Someone leaves a tool behind, perhaps annoyed at the loss. Someone walks across mud with no reason to think the track will last beyond the afternoon. Someone shelters in a cave, eats, rests, moves on. Someone processes an animal, sharpens a stone edge, twists fibre, builds a fire. Almost everything disappears. Then thousands of years later, A researcher kneels in dust and finds one surviving piece. A date is measured, a layer is examined, a method is challenged, another method is added, a model shifts, and the quiet remains of daily life become evidence strong enough to change how we understand a continent. There is a lesson here about certainty. The old timeline felt firm because it was based on the best evidence people had. Then new evidence appeared, and the firm line had to bend. That does not mean science failed. It means science worked, though slowly, with arguments, corrections, and many careful measurements along the way. A good scientific model is not a sacred object. It is a tool. When it explains the evidence well, we use it. When the evidence outgrows it, we revise it. The Clovis-first model helped organise a confusing record for a time, but now the record has become larger. Oregon, New Mexico, Idaho, Chile, Alaska, California, and submerged coastlines all ask to be included in a wider conversation. The result is less tidy, but it is closer to the ground, and the ground is what keeps the memory. Not perfectly, not generously. The Earth forgets far more than it remembers. It grinds bones, washes away camps, breaks tools, burns forests, floods valleys, buries shorelines, and lets delicate things decay. But sometimes it keeps enough. Enough to show that the first page was not where we thought. Enough to show that the Pacific coast may have been a road of water and food rather than a barrier. Enough to show that children walked through Ice Age mud in New Mexico long before Clovis points spread across the continent. Enough to show that Oregon's dry caves and rock shelters still hold clues to a human presence older than the old timeline wanted to allow. If there is comfort in this, it may be that human beings have always been good at finding a way through changing worlds. The Ice Age was not easy. Landscapes shifted, animals moved, coasts changed, weather could be harsh, sea levels rose and swallowed familiar places. Yet people adapted. They crossed, followed, watched, learned, and remembered. They moved along shores, through basins, over ridges, beside lakes, and across mudflats. The same species that worries about lost keys and delayed messages also learned to travel through Ice Age continents with stone tools, fire, memory, and each other. It is a humbling comparison, especially if the keys are currently still missing. So when we ask when people first reached North America, perhaps the most honest answer is that we are still learning how to ask the question properly. It may not have been a single first arrival. It may not have been one path. It may not have looked like the evidence we first recognised. The oldest secure traces may still be younger than the actual first presence. The strongest evidence may come from places that were lucky enough to preserve it. The most important route may be underwater, and some claims, like Cerutti, may remain unresolved until new discoveries either pull them into a wider pattern or leave them as warnings about how careful we must be. What we can say is that the old boundary has moved. Clovis is no longer the beginning. The human story in the Americas is older than that and likely more complicated. Oregon's discoveries matter because they sit near the heart of this change. Paisley Caves and Rimrock Draw show that the western interior has a deep record still being understood. White sand shows that people were far south during a time when the old migration route struggles to explain them. The Kelp Highway gives us a plausible way to imagine early movement along the Pacific, with boats, shorelines, and marine resources guiding people through a world whose coast has since been redrawn. The timeline is not destroyed, it is stretched, it is widened, it has become less like a ruler and more like a landscape. And now, dear listener, we have followed that landscape for a while, from Oregon caves to New Mexico footprints, from broken mastodon bones in California to drowned shorelines along the Pacific, from old certainty to a deeper and more careful kind of uncertainty. We have not solved every question, and it would be suspicious if we had. The past is not a puzzle that gives up all its pieces at once. It is a patient thing. It waits in sediments, in caves, in lake beds, in museum drawers, and perhaps under the sea. It waits for better methods, better questions, and sometimes simply for someone to look again at what was already there. So let me ask you gently, as we settle near the end of this journey, what old ground lies near you? Not necessarily famous ground, not necessarily marked by signs or protected by fences, but the ordinary ground beneath your town, your road, your field, your coast, your home. Who may have walked there before names were written down? What traces might have vanished? What traces might still be waiting? It is a strange thought, but a grounding one. We live on surfaces made of memory. Some memories are human, some are geological, some are no more than pressure marks in mud, and still they matter. If this quiet journey through ancient evidence, changing timelines, and the stubborn memory of the earth has helped you unwind, I would be grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, or shared it with someone who enjoys slow science and old mysteries. It helps this calm little place keep going, one curious question at a time. And if you're listening late at night, perhaps with the room dim and the world outside settling down, remember that time is not only measured by clocks, it is also held in layers, in footprints, in tools, in shorelines, in bones, and in the long silence between discovery and understanding. The old story said the first Americans arrived with Clovis. The ground has been telling us, more softly and more slowly, that people were here before that. Maybe much before that. They came through cold, along water, across mud, into deserts beside lakes, and through landscapes that no longer look the same. They left only fragments, but fragments can be enough. A cave in Oregon, a tool under ash, a line of footprints, a coast beneath the sea. These are small things beside a continent, but they are not small in meaning. They are the Earth's way of remembering what history forgot to write down. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are listening from tonight. May your own steps be gentle, your thoughts grow quiet, and may the ancient ground beneath us keep reminding us that the human story is older, wider, and more surprising than any single timeline can hold.